These blasphemous texts are the Necronomicon. It was written by the mad Arab Al-Hazrad himself. It was found in the possession of a desert-dwelling Sufi tribe in Upper Egypt. It contains forbidden knowledge and unholy incantations. You have been warned. The Grimoire of Nyarlathotep. He who is the messenger and the soul of the blind archons who dance about the black throne of Azathoth is drawn to this earth because it is the fallen body of the goddess Barbelzoa, who cast herself from heaven into the starry pit of matter. He schemes and plots how to wipe our world clean of all material life, so that it may be elevated back to its original high estate, but he is powerless to act except at the capricious whims of mad Azathoth. He whispers his purposes into the ear of Azathoth, but some the blind idiot god heeds, and to others he remains deaf. Even so, Nyarlathotep is the most potent of all the old ones. Before the fall, it had been his custom to sit on the right-hand side of the throne of Azathoth and execute the will of Azathoth on the cosmos. Now, Azathoth has no conscious will of his own, and Nyarlathotep follows his own purposes. He likes to walk up and down upon the earth in the form of a man, which he appropriated ages ago in ancient Egypt. The original soul of the pharaoh was consumed in his cold fire, and Nyarlathotep took up habitation in his shell of flesh, which he rendered deathless by means of his alchemy. It is within the power of Nyarlathotep to take on whatever shape or form he desires, and to move through the gateways of Yog-Sothoth freely. No world or dimension of reality is forbidden to him, yet no matter how wide his wanderings, he is drawn back always to this world in memory of the goddess who sleeps at its heart. When Azathoth pipes his music, and the blind gods dance, Nyarlathotep must fulfill their purposes, for he is their messenger. He rebels against this servitude and seeks to bring about purposes of his own, for his advantage or amusement. Sometimes he succeeds, but sometimes he fails, for Azathoth is capricious in his madness. What man or god may know the song he will choose to play? Nyarlathotep is given power as messenger of the blind gods of creation over the gods of earth that have arisen from the desires and aspirations of mankind. The gods of earth are bound to the earth. They are formed from the dreams of Barbelzoa. She hears in her sleep the crying out of humanity for justice and truth, and her dreaming mind brings forth gods and goddesses that are composed of these principles. She hears the groans of lust and the cries of war, and her dreaming mind shapes gods and goddesses of love or hate. All gods of earth are mere fancies of dreaming Barbelzoa, shadows of her sleepy thoughts. They arose in response to the yearnings of humanity, and to humanity, and its needs they remain forever bound. Nyarlathotep presents these earthly deities and has gathered them together in a great throne room in the place known as Ghatanothoa in the cold waste. He keeps them as pets for his own amusement, and it is only with his approval that they are permitted to answer the prayers of mankind. In this way he seeks to make himself into a smaller image of Azathoth, for as Azathoth rules the cosmos and all its dimensions, so Nyarlathotep seeks to rule this world, which is the body of the dreaming goddess. He hates the gods of earth, for in them is a nobility and purity that he lacks within himself. They are powerless to resist him, and tremble at the sound of his footsteps. Of all the playthings Nyarlathotep has found upon this world, none amuses him more than the race of man. He is known among men as the crawling chaos, because his appearance is often followed by madness. Those who walk in deserts or through wildernesses by night sometimes meet this god and converse with him, never knowing with whom they spoke, or how near they were to death. It is the caprice of Nyarlathotep to hold conversations with men or women when the mood strikes his fancy, and then he may impart to them arcane secrets of precious value. Yet if they approach him when he is angry, he will reach out his bony black hand and touch them upon the forehead, and their bodies will at once crumble to flakes of black dust as their souls are eaten by him. The god may be recognized by his black robes that are wrapped about his long and thin body. Often he walks the desert veiled, but those who have glimpsed behind the veil run mad and scream that he has no face. Yet he may put on any face he chooses as a mask, for none of them are his own. His true face was once carved upon the head of the great statue of Egypt known as the Sphinx, before the pharaoh Khephren in a fit of fury commanded that it be struck off, and placed his own image on the head of the statue. It is whispered that the Order of the Sphinx preserves his true image in their subterranean vaults. Who can say, for those who venture beneath its tail never emerge. This is the seal of Nyarlathotep that is to be inscribed on all instruments and charms devoted to his service or worship. It is not to be confused with his sigil that is extracted from his name upon the magic square of Mercury. Both have power to attract the notice of the god, though neither will guarantee his wayward favor, which he sometimes extends to those who worship him or serve him, but sometimes withholds. Only the great seal of the old ones can compel him to obedience. Think long before you use it. Nyarlathotep never forgets an insult, and never forgives. It is better to propitiate him with offerings and sacrifices and prayers of praise. Those he chooses to favor wax great in wealth and authority, for a time. Eventually the interest of the creeping chaos wanders, and he withdraws his favor and seeks other amusements, leaving them to their own fate. It is best to petition Nyarlathotep in matters that fall under the authority of the sphere of Mercury, for there is harmony between the affairs of this sphere and the nature of Nyarlathotep, who is a messenger for the dancing archons. The magic square of Mercury has power to attract his notice, as does his sigil formed on that square from his name. Nyarlathotep does not dwell in the sphere of Mercury, the length and breadth of the entire cosmos is his home, but he has a harmony with this sphere that may be used by practitioners of magic in their dealings with him. Of the 6 directions, that most in accord with this god is the depths, and this is as it should be, for he is called the creeping chaos. The Demoiselle D's. There be 3 things which are too wonderful for me, yea, for which I know not. The way of an eagle in the air, the way of a serpent upon a rock, the way of a ship in the midst of the sea, and the way of a man with a maid. 1. The utter desolation of the scene began to have its effect. I sat down to face the situation and, if possible, recall to mind some landmark which might aid me in extricating myself from my present position. If I could only find the ocean again, all would be clear, for I knew one could see the island of Groix from the cliffs. I laid down my gun, and kneeling behind a rock lighted a pipe. Then I looked at my watch. It was nearly 4 o'clock. I might have wandered far from Kerslek since daybreak. Standing the day before on the cliffs below Kerslek with Gulvin, looking out over the somber moors among which I had now lost my way, these downs had appeared to me level as a meadow, stretching to the horizon, and although I knew how deceptive is distance, I could not realize that what from Kerslek seemed to be mere grassy hollows were great valleys covered with gorse and heather, and what looked like scattered boulders were in reality enormous cliffs of granite. "It's a bad place for a stranger," old Gulvin had said. "You'd better take a guide," and I had replied, "I shall not lose myself." Now I knew that I had lost myself, as I sat there smoking, with the sea wind blowing in my face. On every side stretched the moorland, covered with flowering gorse and heath and granite boulders. There was not a tree in sight, much less a house. After a while, I picked up the gun, and turning my back on the sun tramped on again. There was little use in following any of the brawling streams which every now and then crossed my path, for, instead of flowing into the sea, they ran inland to reedy pools in the hollows of the moors. I had followed several, but they all led me to swamps or silent little ponds from which the snipe rose peeping and wheeled away in an ecstasy of fright. I began to feel fatigued, and the gun galled my shoulder in spite of the double pads. The sun sank lower and lower, shining level across yellow gorse and the moorland pools. As I walked, my own gigantic shadow led me on, seeming to lengthen at every step. The gorse scraped against my leggings, crackled beneath my feet, showering the brown earth with blossoms, and the brake bowed and billowed along my path. From tufts of heath rabbits scurried away through the bracken, and among the swamp grass I heard the wild duck's drowsy quack. Once a fox stole across my path, and again, as I stooped to drink at a hurrying rill, a heron flapped heavily from the reeds beside me. I turned to look at the sun. It seemed to touch the edges of the plain. When at last I decided that it was useless to go on, and that I must make up my mind to spend at least one night on the moors, I threw myself down thoroughly fagged out. The evening sunlight slanted warm across my body, but the sea winds began to rise, and I felt a chill strike through me from my wet shooting boots. High overhead gulls were wheeling and tossing like bits of white paper. From some distant marsh a solitary curlew called. Little by little the sun sank into the plain, and the zenith flushed with the afterglow. I watched the sky change from palest gold to pink and then to smoldering fire. Clouds of midges danced above me, and high in the calm air a bat dipped and soared. My eyelids began to droop. Then as I shook off the drowsiness a sudden crash among the bracken roused me. I raised my eyes. A great bird hung quivering in the air above my face. For an instant I stared, incapable of motion. Then something leaped past me in the ferns and the bird rose, wheeled, and pitched headlong into the brake. I was on my feet in an instant, peering through the gorse. There came the sound of a struggle from a bunch of heather close by, and then all was quiet. I stepped forward, my gun poised, but when I came to the heather the gun fell under my arm again, and I stood motionless in silent astonishment. A dead hare lay on the ground, and on the hare stood a magnificent falcon, one talon buried in the creature's neck, the other planted firmly on its limp flank. But what astonished me was not the mere sight of a falcon sitting upon its prey. I had seen that more than once. It was that the falcon was fitted with a sort of leash about both talons, and from the leash hung a round bit of metal like a sleigh bell. The bird turned its fierce yellow eyes on me, and then stooped and struck its curved beak into the quarry. At the same instant hurried steps sounded among the heather, and a girl sprang into the covert in front. Without a glance at me she walked up to the falcon, and passing her gloved hand under its breast, raised it from the quarry. Then she deftly slipped a small hood over the bird's head, and holding it out on her gauntlet, stooped and picked up the hare. She passed the cord about the animal's legs and fastened the end of the thong to her girdle. Then she started to retrace her steps through the covert. As she passed me I raised my cap and she acknowledged my presence with a scarcely perceptible inclination. I had been so astonished, so lost in admiration of the scene before my eyes, that it had not occurred to me that here was my salvation. But as she moved away I recollected that unless I wanted to sleep on a windy moor that night I had better recover my speech without delay. At my first word she hesitated, and as I stepped before her I thought a look of fear came into her beautiful eyes. But as I humbly explained my unpleasant plight, her face flushed, and she looked at me in wonder. "Surely you did not come from Kerslake?" she repeated. Her sweet voice had no trace of the Breton accent nor of any accent which I knew, and yet there was something in it I seemed to have heard before, something quaint and indefinable, like the theme of an old song. I explained that I was an American, unacquainted with Finisterre, shooting there for my own amusement. "An American," she repeated in the same quaint musical tones. "I have never before seen an American." For a moment she stood silent, then looking at me she said, "If you should walk all night you could not reach Kerslake now, even if you had a guide." This was pleasant news. "But," I began, "if I could only find a peasant's hut where I might get something to eat, and shelter." The falcon on her wrist fluttered and shook its head. The girl smoothed its glossy back and glanced at me. "Look around," she said gently. "Can you see the end of these moors? Look north, south, east, west. Can you see anything but moorland and bracken?" "No," I said. "The moor is wild and desolate. It is easy to enter, but sometimes they who enter never leave it. There are no peasants' huts here." "Well," I said, "if you will tell me in which direction Kerslake lies, tomorrow it will take me no longer to go back than it has to come." She looked at me again with an expression almost like pity. "Ah," she said, "to come is easy and takes hours. To go is different, and may take centuries." I stared at her in amazement, but decided that I had misunderstood her. Then, before I had time to speak, she drew a whistle from her belt and sounded it. "Sit down and rest," she said to me. "You have come a long distance and are tired." She gathered up her pleated skirts and, motioning me to follow, picked her dainty way through the gorse to a flat rock among the ferns. "They will be here directly," she said, and taking a seat at one end of the rock invited me to sit down on the other edge. The afterglow was beginning to fade in the sky, and a single star twinkled faintly through the rosy haze. A long wavering triangle of waterfowl drifted southward over our heads, and from the swamps around plover were calling. "They are very beautiful, these moors," she said quietly. "Beautiful, but cruel to strangers," I answered. "Beautiful and cruel," she repeated dreamily. "Beautiful and cruel." "Like a woman," I said stupidly. "Oh," she cried with a little catch in her breath, and looked at me. Her dark eyes met mine, and I thought she seemed angry or frightened. "Like a woman," she repeated under her breath. "How cruel to say so." Then, after a pause, as though speaking aloud to herself, "How cruel for him to say that." I don't know what sort of an apology I offered for my inane, though harmless, speech, but I know that she seemed so troubled about it that I began to think I had said something very dreadful without knowing it, and remembered with horror the pitfalls and snares which the French language sets for foreigners. While I was trying to imagine what I might have said, a sound of voices came across the moor, and the girl rose to her feet. "No," she said, with a trace of a smile on her pale face, "I will not accept your apologies, monsieur, but I must prove you wrong, and that shall be my revenge. Look! Here come Hastur and Raoul." Two men loomed up in the twilight. One had a sack across his shoulders and the other carried a hoop before him as a waiter carries a tray. The hoop was fastened with straps to his shoulders, and around the edge of the circlet sat 3 hooded falcons fitted with tinkling bells. The girl stepped up to the falconer, and with a quick turn of her wrist transferred her falcon to the hoop, where it quickly sidled off and nestled among its mates, who shook their hooded heads and ruffled their feathers till the bell jesses tinkled again. The other man stepped forward and, bowing respectfully, took up the hare and dropped it into the game sack. "These are my piqueurs," said the girl, turning to me with a gentle dignity. "Raoul is a good falconer, and I shall some day make him Grand Veneur. Hastur is incomparable." The two silent men saluted me respectfully. "Did I not tell you, monsieur, that I should prove you wrong?" she continued. "This, then, is my revenge, that you do me the courtesy of accepting food and shelter at my own house." Before I could answer, she spoke to the falconers, who started instantly across the heath, and with a gracious gesture to me she followed. I don't know whether I made her understand how profoundly grateful I felt, but she seemed pleased to listen, as we walked over the dewy heather. "Are you not very tired?" she asked. I had clean forgotten my fatigue in her presence, and I told her so. "Don't you think your gallantry is a little old-fashioned?" she said, and when I looked confused and humbled, she added quietly, "Oh, I like it. I like everything old-fashioned, and it is delightful to hear you say such pretty things." The moorland around us was very still now under its ghostly sheet of mist. The plovers had ceased their calling, the crickets and all the little creatures of the fields were silent as we passed, yet it seemed to me as if I could hear them beginning again far behind us. Well in advance, the 2 tall falconers strode across the heather, and the faint jingling of the hawks' bells came to our ears in distant, murmuring chimes. Suddenly a splendid hound dashed out of the mist in front, followed by another and another until 6 or more were bounding and leaping around the girl beside me. She caressed and quieted them with her gloved hand, speaking to them in quaint terms which I remembered to have seen in old French manuscripts. Then the falcons on the circlet borne by the falconer ahead began to beat their wings and scream, and from somewhere out of sight the notes of a hunting horn floated across the moor. The hound sprang away before us and vanished in the twilight, the falcons flapped and squealed upon their perch, and the girl, taking up the song of the horn, began to hum. Clear and mellow her voice sounded in the night air. Chasseur, chasseur, chasses encore, quits Rosette Jean Taunton, 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 oh poor, rabbiter, doloror, que les amours sont de plantain, Taunton, Taunton, Taunton. As I listened to her lovely voice, a grey mass which rapidly grew more distinct loomed up in front, and the horn rang out joyously through the tumult of the hounds and falcons. A torch glimmered at a gate, a light streamed through an opening door, and we stepped upon a wooden bridge which trembled under our feet and rose creaking and straining behind us as we passed over the moat and into a small stone court, walled on every side. From an open doorway a man came and, bending in salutation, presented a cup to the girl beside me. She took the cup and touched it with her lips, then lowering it turned to me and said in a low voice, "I bid you welcome." At that moment one of the falconers came with another cup, but before handing it to me, presented it to the girl, who tasted it. The falconer made a gesture to receive it, but she hesitated a moment, and then, stepping forward, offered me the cup with her own hands. I felt this to be an act of extraordinary graciousness, but hardly knew what was expected of me, and did not raise it to my lips at once. The girl flushed crimson. I saw that I must act quickly. "Mademoiselle," I faltered, "a stranger whom you have saved from dangers he may never realize empties this cup to the gentlest and loveliest hostess of France." "In his name," she murmured, crossing herself as I drained the cup. Then stepping into the doorway she turned to me with a pretty gesture, and taking my hand in hers, led me into the house, saying again and again, "You are very welcome, indeed you are welcome to the Chateau d'Oise." 2. I awoke next morning with the music of the horn in my ears, and leaping out of the ancient bed, went to a curtained window where the sunlight filtered through little deep-set panes. The horn ceased as I looked into the court below. A man who might have been brother to the two falconers of the night before stood in the midst of a pack of hounds. A curved horn was strapped over his back, and in his hand he held a long-lashed whip. The dogs whined and yelped, dancing around him in anticipation. There was the stamp of horses, too, in the walled yard. "Mount!" cried a voice in Breton, and with a clatter of hoofs the two falconers, with falcons upon their wrists, rode into the courtyard among the hounds. Then I heard another voice which sent the blood throbbing through my heart. "Pere Louis, hunt the hounds well and spare either spur nor whip. Thou Raoul and thou Gaston, see that the épervier does not prove himself niais, and if it be best in your judgment, fate's courtoisie à l'oiseau. Jardiner en oiseau, like the mule there on Hastur's wrist, is not difficult, but thou, Raoul, mayest not find it so simple to govern that Haggard. Twice last week he foamed au vif and lost the beccade although he is used to the lure. The bird acts like a stupid branchier. Pater un Haggard n'est pas assez facile." Was I dreaming? The old language of falconry which I had read in yellow manuscripts, the old forgotten French of the Middle Ages was sounding in my ears while the hounds bayed and the hawks' bells tinkled accompaniment to the stamping horses. She spoke again in the sweet forgotten language. "If you would rather attach the lunge and leave thy Haggard au bloc, Raoul, I shall say nothing, for it were a pity to spoil so fair a day's sport with an ill-trained sowers. Esmer baser, it is possibly the best way. C.A. Louis Donnera de Reins." I was perhaps hasty with the bird. It takes time to pass à la filière and the exercises d'escape. Then the falconer Raoul bowed in his stirrups and replied, "If it be the pleasure of Mademoiselle, I shall keep the hawk." "It is my wish," she answered. "Falconry I know, but you have yet to give me many a lesson in artillery, my poor Raoul. Sir Pere Louis mount." The huntsman sprang into an archway and in an instant returned, mounted upon a strong black horse, followed by a piqueur also mounted. "Ah!" she cried joyously, "speed Glemarec René. Speed! Speed all! Sound thy horn, Sir Pere." The silvery music of the hunting horn filled the courtyard, the hounds sprang through the gateway and galloping hoofbeats plunged out of the paved court, loud on the drawbridge, suddenly muffled, then lost in the heather and bracken of the moors. Distant and more distant sounded the horn, until it became so faint that the sudden carol of a soaring lark drowned it in my ears. I heard the voice below responding to some call from within the house. I do not regret the chase, I will go another time. Courtesy to the stranger, Pelage, remember. And a feeble voice came quavering from within the house, courtoisie I stripped, and rubbed myself from head to foot in the huge earthen basin of icy water which stood upon the stone floor at the foot of my bed. Then I looked about for my clothes. They were gone, but on a settle near the door lay a heap of garments, which I inspected with astonishment. As my clothes had vanished, I was compelled to attire myself in the costume which had evidently been placed there for me to wear while my own clothes dried. Everything was there, cap, shoes, and hunting doublet of silvery grey homespun, but the close-fitting costume and seamless shoes belonged to another century, and I remembered the strange costumes of the 3 falconers in the courtyard. I was sure that it was not the modern dress of any portion of France or Brittany, but not until I was dressed and stood before a mirror between the windows did I realize that I was clothed much more like a young huntsman of the Middle Ages than like a Breton of that day. I hesitated and picked up the cap. Should I go down and present myself in that strange guise? There seemed to be no help for it. My own clothes were gone and there was no bell in the ancient chamber to call a servant, so I contented myself with removing a short hawk's feather from the cap, and opening the door, went downstairs. By the fireplace in the large room at the foot of the stairs an old Breton woman sat spinning with a distaff. She looked up at me when I appeared, and smiling frankly, wished me health in the Breton language, to which I laughingly replied in French. At the same moment my hostess appeared and returned my salutation with a grace and dignity that sent a thrill to my heart. Her lovely head with its dark curly hair was crowned with a headdress which set all doubts as to the epoch of my own costume at rest. Her slender figure was exquisitely set off in the homespun hunting gown edged with silver, and on her gauntlet-covered wrist she bore one of her petted hawks. With perfect simplicity she took my hand and led me into the garden in the court, and seating herself before a table invited me very sweetly to sit beside her. Then she asked me in her soft quaint accent how I had passed the night, and whether I was very much inconvenienced by wearing the clothes which old Pelage had put there for me while I slept. I looked at my own clothes and shoes, drying in the sun by the garden wall, and hated them. What horrors they were compared with the graceful costume which I now wore. I told her this laughing, but she agreed with me very seriously. "We will throw them away," she said in a quiet voice. In my astonishment I attempted to explain that I not only could not think of accepting clothes from anybody, although for all I knew it might be the custom of hospitality in that part of the country, but that I should cut an impossible figure if I returned to France clothed as I was then. She laughed and tossed her pretty head, saying something in old French which I did not understand, and then Pelage trotted out with a tray on which stood 2 bowls of milk, a loaf of white bread, fruit, a platter of honeycomb, and a flagon of deep red wine. "You see I have not yet broken my fast because I wish you to eat with me. But I am very hungry," she smiled. "I would rather die than forget one word of what you have said," I blurted out, while my cheeks burned. "She will think me mad," I added to myself, but she turned to me with sparkling eyes. "Ah," she murmured. "Then monsieur knows all that there is of chivalry." She crossed herself and broke bread. I sat and watched her white hands, not daring to raise my eyes to hers. "Will you not eat?" she asked. "Why do you look so troubled?" "Ah, why? I knew it now. I knew I would give my life to touch with my lips those rosy palms. I understood now that from the moment when I looked into her dark eyes there on the moor last night I had loved her. My great and sudden passion held me speechless. "Are you ill at ease?" she asked again. Then, like a man who pronounces his own doom, I answered in a low voice. "Yes, I am ill at ease for love of you." And as she did not stir nor answer, the same power moved my lips in spite of me, and I said, I, who am unworthy of the lightest of your thoughts, I who abuse hospitality and repay your gentle courtesy with bold presumption, I love you. She leaned her head upon her hands, and answered softly, I love you. Your words are very dear to me. I love you. Then I shall win you. Win me, she replied. But all the time I had been sitting silent, my face turned toward her. She, also silent, her sweet face resting on her upturned palm, sat facing me, and as her eyes looked into mine I knew that neither she nor I had spoken human speech, but I knew that her soul had answered mine, and I drew myself up feeling youth and joyous love coursing through every vein. She, with a bright color in her lovely face, seemed as one awakened from a dream, and her eyes sought mine with a questioning glance which made me tremble with delight. We broke our fast, speaking of ourselves. I told her my name, and she told me hers, the Demoiselle Jean Dys. She spoke of her father and mother's death, and how the 19 of her years had been passed in a little fortified farm alone with her nurse Pelagie, Glemarec René the Picker, and the 4 falconers, Raoul, Gaston, Hastur, and the Sieur Pierre Louis, who had served her father. She had never been outside the moorland, never even had seen a human soul before, except the falconers and Pelagie. She did not know how she had heard of Kerslake. Perhaps the falconers had spoken of it. She knew the legends of Loup-Garou and Jean La Flamme from her nurse Pelagie. She embroidered and spun flax. Her hawks and hounds were her only distraction. When she had met me there on the moor she had been so frightened that she almost dropped at the sound of my voice. She had, it was true, seen ships at sea from the cliffs, but as far as the eye could reach the moors over which she galloped were destitute of any sign of human life. There was a legend which old Pelagie told, how anybody once lost in the unexplored moorland might never return, because the moors were enchanted. She did not know whether it was true. She never had thought about it until she met me. She did not know whether the falconers had even been outside, or whether they could go if they would. The books in the house which Pelagie, the nurse, had taught her to read were hundreds of years old. All this she told me with a sweet seriousness seldom seen in anyone but children. My own name she found easy to pronounce, and insisted, because my first name was Philip, I must have French blood in me. She did not seem curious to learn anything about the outside world, and I thought perhaps she considered it had forfeited her interest and respect from the stories of her nurse. We were still sitting at the table, and she was throwing grapes to the small field birds which came fearlessly to our very feet. I began to speak in a vague way of going, but she would not hear of it, and before I knew it I had promised to stay a week and hunt with hawk and hound in their company. I also obtained permission to come again from Kerslake and visit her after my return. Why, she said innocently, I do not know what I should do if you never came back, and I, knowing that I had no right to awaken her with the sudden shock which the avowal of my own love would bring to her, sat silent, hardly daring to breathe. You will come very often? She asked. Very often, I said. Every day. Every day. Oh, she sighed, I am very happy. Come and see my hawks. She rose and took my hand again with a childlike innocence of possession, and we walked through the garden and fruit trees to a grassy lawn which was bordered by a brook. Over the lawn were scattered 15 or 20 stumps of trees, partially embedded in the grass, and upon all of these except 2 sat falcons. They were attached to the stumps by thongs which were in turn fastened with steel rivets to their legs just above the talons. A little stream of pure spring water flowed in a winding course within easy distance of each perch. The birds set up a clamor when the girl appeared, but she went from one to another, caressing some, taking others for an instant upon her wrist, or stooping to adjust their jesses. Are they not pretty? She said. See, here is a falcon jaunty. We call it ignoble, because it takes the quarry in direct chase. This is a blue falcon. In falconry we call it noble because it rises over the quarry, and wheeling, drops upon it from above. This white bird is a gerfalcon from the north. It is also noble. Here is a merlin, and this tiercelet is a falcon heroner. I asked her how she had learned the old language of falconry. She did not remember, but thought her father must have taught it to her when she was very young. Then she led me away and showed me the young falcons still in the nest. They are termed nyais in falconry, she explained. A branchier is the young bird which is just able to leave the nest and hop from branch to branch. A young bird which has not yet molted is called Azathoth, and a mia is a hawk which has molted in captivity. When we catch a wild falcon which has changed its plumage we term it a haggard. Raoul first taught me to dress a falcon. Shall I teach you how it is done? She seated herself on the bank of the stream among the falcons, and I threw myself at her feet to listen. Then the Demoiselle held up one rosy-tipped finger, and began very gravely. First one must catch the falcon. I am caught, I answered. She laughed very prettily and told me my dressage would perhaps be difficult, as I was noble. I am already tamed, I replied, jessied and belled. She laughed, delighted. Oh, my brave falcon, then you will return at my call. I am yours, I answered gravely. She sat silent for a moment. Then the color heightened in her cheeks, and she held up her finger again, saying, Listen, I wish to speak of falconry. I listen, Countess Jean de Wyas. But again she fell into the reverie, and her eyes seemed fixed on something beyond the summer clouds. Philip, she said at last. Jean, I whispered. That is all, that is what I wished, she sighed, Philip and Jean. She held her hand toward me and I touched it with my lips. Win me, she said, but this time it was the body and soul which spoke in unison. After a while she began again. Let us speak of falconry. Begin, I replied. We have caught the falcon. Then Jean de Wyas took my hand in both of hers and told me how with infinite patience the young falcon was taught to perch upon the wrist, how little by little it became used to the belled jesses and the chaperone à cornet. They must first have a good appetite, she said, then little by little I reduced their nourishment, which in falconry we call pat. When, after many nights passed au bloc as these birds are now, I prevail upon the haggard to stay quietly on the wrist, then the bird is ready to be taught to come for its food. I fix the pat to the end of a thong, or lure, and teach the bird to come to me as soon as I begin to whirl the cord in circles about my head. At first I drop the pat when the falcon comes, and he eats the food on the ground. After a little he will learn to seize the lure in motion as I whirl it around my head or drag it over the ground. After this it is easy to teach the falcon to strike at game, always remembering to faire courtoisie les eaux, that is, to allow the bird to taste the quarry. A squeal from one of the falcons interrupted her, and she arose to adjust a lunge which had become whipped about the block, but the bird still flapped its wings and screamed. What is the matter? She said. Philip, can you see? I looked around and at first saw nothing to cause the commotion, which was now heightened by the screams and flapping of all the birds. Then my eye fell upon the flat rock beside the stream from which the girl had risen. A grey serpent was moving slowly across the surface of the boulder, and the eyes in its flat triangular head sparkled like jet. A caliver, she said quietly. It is harmless, is it not? I asked. She pointed to the black V-shaped figure on the neck. It is certain death, she said, it is a viper. We watched the reptile moving slowly over the smooth rock to where the sunlight fell in a broad warm patch. I started forward to examine it, but she clung to my arm crying, Don't, Philip, I am afraid. For me. For you, Philip, I love you. Then I took her in my arms and kissed her on the lips, but all I could say was, Jean, Jean, Jean. And as she lay trembling on my breast, something struck my foot in the grass below, but I did not heed it. Then again something struck my ankle, and a sharp pain shot through me. I looked into the sweet face of Jean de Wyas and kissed her, and with all my strength lifted her in my arms and flung her from me. Then bending, I tore the viper from my ankle and set my heel upon its head. I remember feeling weak and numb, I remember falling to the ground. Through my slowly glazing eyes I saw Jean's white face bending close to mine, and when the light in my eyes went out I still felt her arms about my neck, and her soft cheek against my drawn lips. When I opened my eyes, I looked around in terror. Jean was gone. I saw the stream and the flat rock. I saw the crushed viper in the grass beside me, but the hawks and blocks had disappeared. I sprang to my feet. The garden, the fruit trees, the drawbridge, and the walled court were gone. I stared stupidly at a heap of crumbling ruins, ivy-covered and gray, through which great trees had pushed their way. I crept forward, dragging my numbed foot, and as I moved, a falcon sailed from the treetops among the ruins, and soaring, mounting in narrowing circles, faded and vanished in the clouds above. "Jean, Jean," I cried, but my voice died on my lips, and I fell on my knees among the weeds. And as God willed it, I, not knowing, had fallen kneeling before a crumbling shrine carved in stone for our Mother of Sorrows. I saw the sad face of the Virgin wrought in the cold stone. I saw the cross and thorns at her feet, and beneath it I read, "Pray for the soul of the Demoiselle Jean de Wise, who died in her youth for love of Philip, a stranger." A.D. 1573. But upon the icy slab lay a woman's glove still warm and fragrant. In Memoria Additum. SCP-4476. Church of the Eternal Mother. SCP-4476 is a small fishing village accessible only by boat in the far western part of Plaquemines Parish, Louisiana, with an estimated population of 45. The entire population, designated SCP-4476-1, is made up of members of the Natau family, and they all display significant birth defects and physical abnormalities. These physical abnormalities primarily present as large tumorous growths as a result of fetus in foetu. These growths are treated with a great deal of respect, and SCP-4476-1 refer to them as the unborn. The language spoken by SCP-4476-1 is a fusion of Proto-Uralic Aditite mixed with the local French-English Creole. While it is uncertain how long this family has lived in the area, linguistic drift analysis suggests that they originally spoke Aditite, with the local Creole adopted sometime in the latter half of the 17th century. The social hierarchy of SCP-4476-1 revolves around a group of 5 visually identical, elderly females, designated SCP-4476-1A, which the others refer to collectively as Mama Natau. It is unclear how SCP-4476-1 distinguishes between the 5, and careful genetic sampling indicates that the 5 sisters represent the matriarchal genesis of every other member of SCP-4476-1. It is also of note that one of the 5 instances of SCP-4476-1A is always pregnant. The population of SCP-4476 remains exceptionally stable even with the observed rate of pregnancies. There have been no reported cases of illness within the family group, and no observed accidental deaths. It is currently unknown whether the absence of additional children is a result of stillbirth, or a high infant mortality rate. When asked about this phenomena or the anomalously high pregnancies, the locals will give evasive or non-answers. The villagers rarely travel far from SCP-4476, and thus their diet is restricted to the flora and fauna that can be found within the exclusion zone. Dietary staples include several types of fish, a variety of swamp cabbage one cultivated in a nearby field, several species of frogs, and small alligators. The infrastructure of SCP-4476 is made up of one large residential structure, a storage shed, a small building primarily used for drying collected swamp cabbage, a short dock with several small fishing punts, and a medium-sized anomalous 2 structure that serves as both a religious gathering place and birthing house. SCP-4476-1 spend the majority of their time either working in the cabbage field, fishing, cooking, or mending the nets they utilize for fishing and catching frogs. SCP-4476-1 adhere to a strict pattern of 6 working days with a single day of religious observance. While generally tolerant of Foundation researchers, SCP-4476-1 will become hostile to all outsiders that intrude on their religious practices. These rituals take place inside the church-like structure, and until recently have been entirely unobserved. SCP-4476 is contained within a 3-kilometer exclusion zone on the far western edge of Plaquemines Parish, Louisiana. Site-93A has been set up in the nearby town of Port Sulphur under the cover story Lambda Mu-22A, Gulf Shore Cleanup Operation. Additionally, the local economy has been artificially depressed in order to encourage the local residents to leave, as well as to discourage population growth. MTF Beta 2 Bayou Boys are to routinely patrol the nearby marshlands to prevent outside intrusion as well as to contain the inhabitants of SCP-4476 from exiting the exclusion zone. Due to the high-traffic nature of the bayou fishing industry, additional resources have been allocated to the containment of SCP-4476. This includes the expansion of MTF Beta 2 to company strength, with a variety of amphibious vehicles and several bayou patrol helicopters. Any non-SCP-4476 resident apprehended attempting to enter the exclusion zone is to be interrogated and released after amnestic treatment. SCP-4476 was initially discovered in late April of 2010, following reports of concern for a Nalka Family 3 made by several denizens of Loi 504 La Rue Macabre during the cleanup of the Deepwater incident involving SCP. These reports were followed up on by members of MTF Beta 2 Bayou Boys, and they were eventually able to locate the village. Initial contact was made with the villagers on April 29, 2010. Due to the isolated nature of the area, it was decided that SCP-4476 should be contained in its original location. Site-93A was established utilizing the cleanup effort as cover, and remains there to this day. While SCP-4476-1 mostly ignored the Foundation presence, no headway was made in successfully establishing a permanent research presence, primarily due to the difficulty presented by the language barrier. Upon a request by Site Director Stanley Arthur, the Foundation Oversight Committee agreed to bring in Dr. Isabel Beaumont, a local anthropologist that had previously shown marked success in developing ongoing contact with other local indigenous cultural groups. Her relevant research logs and memorandum are included. Researcher, Dr. Isabel Beaumont. August 8, 2010. Personal log. Despite the obvious heavy-handedness of this foundation, I was excited to be involved in this project. I wasn't quite sure what to expect, even after reviewing the documents that Dr. Arthur had provided. I read the reports from Dr. Desmarais, and I admit I still wasn't quite prepared for what I met when I first arrived at the Natal family village. While the obvious physical deformities displayed by the family are a bit unusual, I didn't really see anything to differentiate this family from many other cultural groups in the area. Subsistence farmers, strong ties to the local ecology, communal living arrangements, etc. Even their language, while differing quite a bit in certain verb phrasing and word usage, is not entirely different from other variations of Louisiana French Creole I've encountered before. What really threw me off was their temple. The Natal referred to it as Sac-Kirak, which according to the lexicon given to me by Dr. Arthur means roughly holy, or sacred, temple, with connotations of it being alive. I thought that would mean that it was made of living plant matter, grown directly from the swamp. I couldn't have been more wrong. I don't think I can do this. Researcher, Dr. Isabel Beaumont. August 9, 2010. Personal log. After giving it a lot of thought and drinking copious amounts of tea, I've decided that weird as they are, the Natal represent an excellent opportunity to study a cultural group that has so far been undocumented by modern anthropological science. I had no idea that such an unknown group could exist in the United States. Anyway, even with the revulsion that I feel towards their temple, it is my job to document it to the best of my ability. The building itself is rather small, covering an area of roughly 47 square meters. Like the other Natal structures, it stands on pilings driven into the swamp, but it is only connected to the rest of the platform by a short bridge made from strands of sinew and supported by planks of bone. The pilings themselves look like grotesquely extended arms with fused elbow joints. The hands are splayed quite widely across the soft ground of the area beneath it, with the fingers disappearing into the turf, remarkably similarly to a tree's root structure. There are no window openings into the interior, and the only entrance appears to be a large sphincter in the side facing the rest of the Natau settlement. We've not been allowed to remain during the Natau holy day, so I haven't been able to get a peek inside. Not sure if I want to, really. The accessible portion of the building stands about 9 feet tall at its highest point, and is in a rough oblong shape, giving it somewhat of a Quonset hut appearance. For some reason, looking at it for too long gives me a bit of a headache, and I had no desire to get a closer view. The Natau clearly didn't want me to anyway, so that was a bit of a relief. End of log. Despite Dr. Beaumont's initial hesitation, significant progress was made towards understanding SCP-4476-1 and their way of life. After several months of study and interaction, Dr. Beaumont was able to give valuable insight into their language and cultural heritage. The bulk of Dr. Beaumont's notes and reference materials has been omitted for brevity, but are available upon request. In June of 2011, Dr. Beaumont made a request on behalf of SCP-4476-1 for a semi-permanent generator, as well as lighting, an electric stove, and a refrigeration unit. After a series of exchanges between Dr. Beaumont and Dr. Arthur, this request was granted. This marked a significant turn in the Foundation's relationship with SCP-4476-1, and Dr. Beaumont began spending most of her time at the village. The SCP document now shows the second Dr. Beaumont personal log. It reads: Researcher, Dr. Isabel Beaumont. June 19, 2011. Personal log. I think that I've finally been accepted by La Famille Natau. I've been spending a lot of time at the village speaking to the younger members of the family, and I've even been able to take part in some of their meals and daily rituals. They still won't let me stay during their holy day, but I think that might also change. After getting the Foundation to put in the generator and lights, I think that the family has begun to see the benefit of having me around. I also think that I'm beginning to understand the differences between the Mamos Natau, at least in how they reference them. There is a definite sequence to their pregnancies. Only one of them carries a child at any one time. Whichever one is pregnant, the others begin referring to her as Manma Nuta, which is close enough to Manma Natau that I think that most would simply chalk it up to a slip of the tongue. But on a hunch I looked into it, and Nuta is close enough to be the late Aditite Nuta, which is their word for sorceress or shaman. This cannot be a coincidence, and it is significant in unlocking more of their cultural mysteries. It took some convincing, but I managed to persuade the current Manma Nuta to sit down with me for a more structured interview. Now let's see if I have enough of a grasp on their dialect to translate it for the other Foundation researchers. End of log. On June 20, 2011, Dr. Beaumont conducted an interview with one of the SCP-4476-1A instances. The interview was conducted in the local dialect of Louisiana Creole and was translated by Dr. Beaumont. A portion of that translation follows. Interviewed, Manma Nuta, resident of SCP-4476. Interviewer, Dr. Isabel Beaumont, SCP-4476 head researcher. Forward, this is the first time that any of the Mamos Natau have consented to sit down for a structured interview. While I've talked with them several times, they've remained reluctant to share much. Dr. Beaumont sat down with Manma Nuta, a member of a community that had been living in the area for generations. She wanted to learn more about their history and culture. Dr. Beaumont began. I'd like to ask you a bit about your history, how long you've been here, and... Manma Nuta interrupted. You would not believe me, Mina. None of the children of this new land ever do. Even old man Nancy does not believe. Dr. Beaumont was taken aback, but she remained curious and asked Nuda to share her stories and tales anyway. I remember the burning towers of Gyros as we sailed away. Karsus Mexa wanted to go Cthylla, to reunite with our beloved Ion, but we could not, Nuda said. Dr. Beaumont was confused and asked for clarification. Nuda explained that it was a long time ago, before even Dr. Beaumont's ancestors knew of this land. A storm had ravaged the Aegean, and they were swept past the Great Rock, into the endless waters of the Western Sea. They were lost and adrift, until they landed in the far north, where they tried to make a place for themselves. Why didn't you just try and go home? Dr. Beaumont asked. We all knew that the Grand Karsus had fallen, Mina. There was no home to return to, Nuda replied. Dr. Beaumont accepted Nuda's explanation, and they moved on to another topic. She had noticed that Nuda's family rarely got sick and asked her about it. Ion has blessed us, Mina. We use his gift to keep the Alaxic safe from the small things in the waters, Nuda said. Dr. Beaumont was familiar with the Nalka divinity, and assumed it was what Nuda was referring to. However, Nuda clarified that Ion was not the Nalka divinity. The Grand Karsus was their intercessor, who had taught them the way and showed them how to be more. They kept to his ways and shaped their Alak to become a vessel for his return. I am confused. You said that your Grand Karsus fell. Is Ion the name you give to your current Grand Karsus? Dr. Beaumont asked. Yes and no. Beloved Ion is no longer of this world, but he is still with us, in our blood, in the way. He is our only Grand Karsus, and he will return to guide all of his children to Adytum. We seek purity in order to join him when the time comes, Nuda explained. Dr. Beaumont was intrigued but had more questions. She asked Nuda about Karsus Mexa, and Nuda hesitated, saying it was something that Dr. Beaumont would not believe. Dr. Beaumont respected Nuda's wishes and changed the subject to fishing. The rest of their conversation was unremarkable, and Dr. Beaumont ended the interview shortly after. End of log. After several more successful interviews, mostly involving details of the daily life of SCP-4476-1, Dr. Beaumont was invited to participate in a birthing ritual. Her request to attend was initially denied by the site director, but that decision was overruled by the Oversight Committee in the interest of gaining more information regarding the activities of SCP-4476-1. Dr. Isabel Beaumont. September 8, 2011. Personal log. I was finally given a chance to observe one of the Natau's religious ceremonies. It was quite a fight for me to get permission to attend, and I guessed that Dr. Arthur was overruled by someone higher up the chain than him. Even then, he wanted to send a group of the Bayou boys with me, but I flatly refused. Manma Nuda was quite clear that only I was allowed to attend, and she wouldn't let me take any equipment in with me. I can only imagine what would have happened if a group of Foundation operatives tried to bully their way in with me. In the end, there was nothing for anyone to worry about. The ritual was only a little stranger than some of the other birthing practices I've observed in the past. Well, maybe a lot stranger, but I was still in no danger. The inside of the Kirok was pretty much what I expected. The walls pulsed, and when the sphincter opened, I swear it was like walking down the throat of some huge animal. I'm used to moist, warm air. I've been living in the swamp for years. But it was different. It had a smell to it that. The whole building was a single room centered around a small pool grown into the floor. I wasn't certain, but I think the liquid in the pool was some analog to amniotic fluid. It certainly had a similar viscosity. And smell. The entire room was lit by numerous small candles that were placed in small niches in the walls. When everyone had gathered inside, there wasn't much room to move around. It also got quite warm, and I regretted not adopting the Natau practice of participating mostly nude. When everyone had gathered and the door had closed, the ritual began. The 4 non-pregnant Manma Natau stood around the pool and assisted Manma Nuda as she climbed into it. After she was settled, everyone sat on the floor and began to chant. It took hours, and I felt every minute of it. The air was stiflingly hot, and I had difficulty breathing. Nothing much seemed to change for quite a while. Then Nutter began to struggle with the birthing process. I have no idea how many children she's given birth to over the years, but I could clearly see that the process was quite painful for her. Each time she pushed, she would grunt in agony, and the rest of the Natal would chant louder. There was an energy to it that I can't describe, and I felt myself carried along with it. Eventually everything came to a climax, and she was able to finally give birth. I must admit, I was enthralled by the whole affair, but when Natal lifted the baby from the flea pool, I was horrified. I cannot describe what I saw. Suffice it to say that the child was a stillbirth. Afterwards I was told that most of the children born to the Natal don't survive. They either are stillbirths or they die a few days later. Either way, the infant mortality rate is really high and, well, they use the babies to feed the Kirak, and that's all I'm going to say about that. End of log. Dr. Beaumont then was invited to participate in an overnight ritual with SCP-4476-1. She indicated that she had been invited to join the family, and expressed interest. She assured Dr. Arthur that this was standard practice within many indigenous peoples, and it would be a formality that would be rude to ignore. The next morning, Dr. Beaumont failed to return from her stay with SCP-4476-1. On the morning of July 11th, 4 members of MTF Beta 2 Bayou Boys raided SCP-4476 with the objective of either retrieving Dr. Beaumont or ascertaining her status. The following is a transcript of that raid from the viewpoint of the team lead, Sergeant Arnaud. This is the transcript of their video exploration log. MTF Beta 2 Bayou Boys. Search and rescue of Dr. Isabel Beaumont from SCP-4476. Team Lead, Sergeant Nicholas Arnaud, Alpha. Begin log. The team of Beta 2 was on a mission to retrieve Dr. Beaumont from SCP-4476, a location known for its anomalous properties. As they approached the site, Alpha addressed the team, boys and girl, check your equipment and comms. Stick together, and we shouldn't have any problems until we try and enter the temple. Delta, you're our cutter if the door doesn't open for us. Delta let out a sigh. I hate that we're all called boys. Alpha replied, take it up with Command, Delta. You weren't around when Beta 2 was formed. The team arrived at SCP-4476, but SCP-4476-1 mostly ignored them until they got closer to the temple. An SCP-4476-1A instance was seen pointing their way, and Alpha turned to Beta. Looks like they're taking notice of us. Beta, go. Beta jogged across the bridge to the temple, and Alpha and Delta followed closely behind. Suddenly, several SCP-4476-1 ran towards them, each clutching farming implements. Alpha ordered Gamma, keep them off our 6. Delta, go for insertion. Delta moved ahead carrying a tool and pushed it into the skin around the sphincter, causing her to be coated in gore. After a few seconds, a hole large enough for the team to enter had been cut into the side of the building. As Beta reached the pool inside the temple, Alpha looked around and saw Dr. Beaumont partially absorbed by the wall. Shit, check for vitals, he ordered. Beta approached Dr. Beaumont and exclaimed, damn, Sarge. Is that? Alpha turned to Beta, Christ, what the hell is it supposed to be? We'll get you out of there, hold on. Dr. Beaumont coughed and gasped, this isn't what it looks like. Muffled gunshots were heard from outside, and Delta shouted, Sarge, hurry up in there, it looks like the whole damn town is fixin' to come down on us. Alpha turned back to Dr. Beaumont, who was struggling to speak. No. Don't. She coughed, blood frothing at the corners of her mouth. They wanted me to join the family. They wanted me to become part of Manma Natau. I went willingly. I just wasn't strong enough. Beta cut Dr. Beaumont down, and the team quickly extracted to the waiting helicopter. The team faced more resistance from SCP-4476-1 individuals, resulting in the incapacitation of 3 of them. As they flew away from SCP-4476, Alpha let out a sigh of relief. "We've retrieved the document. I don't want to hang out here any longer than we have to." End log. Dr. Beaumont was taken directly to the Site 93A infirmary where she was pronounced dead. As per protocol, an autopsy was performed and her cause of death was listed as massive exsanguination due to improper surgical procedure. Also of note is that her uterus and reproductive organs were missing in toto and were never recovered. From the data retrieved from Dr. Beaumont's notes, it is believed that SCP-4476-1A were attempting to harvest genetic material from Dr. Beaumont in order to integrate her into the family. An update of the SCP file stated that an additional iteration of SCP-4476-1A has been observed. It should also be noted that all 6 iterations are showing signs of pregnancy. All further contact with SCP-4476 has been restricted until further notice. The Silver Key. By HP Lovecraft. Written 1926. When Randolph Carter was 30, he lost the key of the Gate of Dreams. Prior to that time, he had made up for the prosiness of life by nightly excursions to strange and ancient cities beyond space, and lovely, unbelievable garden lands across ethereal seas. But as middle age hardened upon him, he felt those liberties slipping away little by little, until at last he was cut off altogether. No more could his galley sail up the river Akronos past the gilded spires of Thran, or his elephant caravans tramp through perfumed jungles and Kled, where forgotten palaces with veined ivory columns sleep lovely and unbroken under the moon. He had read much of things as they are, and talked with too many people. Well-meaning philosophers had taught him to look into the logical relations of things, and analyze the processes which shaped his thoughts and fancies. Wonder had gone away, and he had forgotten that all life is only a set of pictures in the brain, among which there is no difference betwixt those born of real things and those born of inward dreamings, and no cause to value the one above the other. Custom had dinned into his ears a superstitious reverence for that which tangibly and physically exists, and had made him secretly ashamed to dwell in visions. Wise men told him his simple fancies were inane and childish, and even more absurd because their actors persist in fancying them full of meaning and purpose as the blind cosmos grinds aimlessly on from nothing to something and from something back to nothing again, either heeding nor knowing the wishes or existence of the minds that flicker for a second now and then in the darkness. They had chained him down to things that are, and had then explained the workings of those things till mystery had gone out of the world. When he complained, and longed to escape into twilight realms where magic molded all the little vivid fragments and prized associations of his mind into vistas of breathless expectancy and unquenchable delight, they turned him instead toward the newfound prodigies of science, bidding him find wonder in the atom's vortex and mystery in the sky's dimensions. And when he had failed to find these boons in things whose laws are known and measurable, they told him he lacked imagination, and was immature because he preferred dream illusions to the illusions of our physical creation. So Carter had tried to do as others did, and pretended that the common events and emotions of earthly minds were more important than the fantasies of rare and delicate souls. He did not dissent when they told him that the animal pain of a stuck pig or dyspeptic plowman in real life is a greater thing than the peerless beauty of Neroth with its 100 carven gates and domes of Chalcedony, which he dimly remembered from his dreams, and under their guidance he cultivated a painstaking sense of pity and tragedy. Once in a while, though, he could not help seeing how shallow, fickle, and meaningless all human aspirations are, and how emptily our real impulses contrast with those pompous ideals we profess to hold. Then he would have recourse to the polite laughter they had taught him to use against the extravagance and artificiality of dreams, for he saw that the daily life of our world is every inch as extravagant and artificial, and far less worthy of respect because of its poverty in beauty and its silly reluctance to admit its own lack of reason and purpose. In this way he became a kind of humorist, for he did not see that even humor is empty in a mindless universe devoid of any true standard of consistency or inconsistency. In the first days of his bondage he had turned to the gentle churchly faith endeared to him by the naive trust of his fathers, for thence stretched mystic avenues which seemed to promise escape from life. Only on closer view did he mark the starved fancy and beauty, the stale and prosy triteness, and the oldish gravity and grotesque claims of solid truth which reigned boresomely and overwhelmingly among most of its professors, or feel to the full the awkwardness with which it sought to keep alive as literal fact the outgrown fears and guesses of a primal race confronting the unknown. It wearied Carter to see how solemnly people tried to make earthly reality out of old myths which every step of their boasted science confuted, and this misplaced seriousness killed the attachment he might have kept for the ancient creeds had they been content to offer the sonorous rites and emotional outlets in their true guise of ethereal fantasy. But when he came to study those who had thrown off the old myths, he found them even more ugly than those who had not. They did not know that beauty lies in harmony, and that loveliness of life has no standard amidst an aimless cosmos save only its harmony with the dreams and the feelings which have gone before and blindly molded our little spheres out of the rest of chaos. They did not see that good and evil and beauty and ugliness are only ornamental fruits of perspective, whose sole value lies in their linkage to what chance made our fathers think and feel, and whose finer details are different for every race and culture. Instead, they either denied these things altogether or transferred them to the crude, vague instincts which they shared with the beasts and peasants, so that their lives were dragged malodorously out in pain, ugliness, and disproportion, yet filled with a ludicrous pride at having escaped from something no more unsound than that which still held them. They had traded the false gods of fear and blind piety for those of license and anarchy. Carter did not taste deeply of these modern freedoms, for their cheapness and squalor sickened a spirit-loving beauty alone, while his reason rebelled at the flimsy logic with which their champions tried to gild brute impulse with a sacredness stripped from the idols they had discarded. He saw that most of them, in common with their cast-off priestcraft, could not escape from the delusion that life has a meaning apart from that which men dream into it, and could not lay aside the crude notion of ethics and obligations beyond those of beauty, even when all nature shrieked of its unconsciousness and impersonal unmorality in the light of their scientific discoveries. Calm, lasting beauty comes only in a dream, and this solace the world had thrown away when in its worship of the real it threw away the secrets of childhood and innocence. Calm, lasting beauty comes only in a dream, and this solace the world had thrown away when in its worship of the real it threw away the secrets of childhood and innocence. Amidst this chaos of hollowness and unrest Carter tried to live as befitted a man of keen thought and good heritage. With his dreams fading under the ridicule of the age he could not believe in anything, but the love of harmony kept him close to the ways of his race and station. He walked impassive through the cities of men, and sighed because no vista seemed fully real, because every flash of yellow sunlight on tall roofs and every glimpse of balustrade plazas in the first lamps of evening served only to remind him of dreams he had once known, and to make him homesick for ethereal lands he no longer knew how to find. Travel was only a mockery, and even the Great War stirred him but little, though he served from the first in the Foreign Legion of France. For a while he sought friends, but soon grew weary of the crudeness of their emotions, and the sameness and earthiness of their visions. He felt vaguely glad that all his relatives were distant and out of touch with him, for they would not have understood his mental life. That is, none but his grandfather and great-uncle Christopher could, and they were long dead. Then he began once more the writing of books, which he had left off when dreams first failed him. But here, too, was there no satisfaction or fulfillment, for the touch of earth was upon his mind, and he could not think of lovely things as he had done of yore. Ironic humor dragged down all the twilight minarets he reared, and the earthy fear of improbability blasted all the delicate and amazing flowers in his fairy gardens. The convention of assumed pity spilt mawkishness on his characters, while the myth of an important reality and significant human events and emotions debased all his high fantasy into thin-veiled allegory and cheap social satire. His new novels were successful as his old ones had never been, and because he knew how empty they must be to please an empty herd, he burned them and ceased his writing. They were very graceful novels, in which he urbanely laughed at the dreams he lightly sketched, but he saw that their sophistication had sapped all their life away. It was after this that he cultivated deliberate illusion, and dabbled in the notions of the bizarre and the eccentric as an antidote for the commonplace. Most of these, however, soon showed their poverty and barrenness, and he saw that the popular doctrines of occultism are as dry and inflexible as those of science, yet without even the slender palliative of truth to redeem them. Gross stupidity, falsehood, and muddled thinking are not dream, and form no escape from life to a mind trained above their own level. So Carter bought stranger books and sought out deeper and more terrible men of fantastic erudition, delving into arcana of consciousness that few have trod, and learning things about the secret pits of life, legend, and immemorial antiquity which disturbed him ever afterward. He decided to live on a rarer plane, and furnished his Boston home to suit his changing moods, one room for each, hung in appropriate colors, furnished with befitting books and objects, and provided with sources of the proper sensations of light, heat, sound, taste, and odor. Once he heard of a man in the South, who was shunned and feared for the blasphemous things he read in prehistoric books and clay tablets smuggled from India and Arabia. Him he visited, living with him and sharing his studies for 7 years, till horror overtook them one midnight in an unknown and archaic graveyard, and only one emerged where two had entered. Then he went back to Arkham, the terrible witch-haunted old town of his forefathers in New England, and had experiences in the dark, amidst the hoary willows and tottering gambrel roofs, which made him seal forever certain pages in the diary of a wild-minded ancestor. But these horrors took him only to the edge of reality, and were not of the true dream country he had known in youth, so that at 50 he despaired of any rest or contentment in a world grown too busy for beauty and too shrewd for dreams. Having perceived at last the hollowness and futility of real things, Carter spent his days in retirement, and in wistful disjointed memories of his dream-filled youth. He thought it rather silly that he bothered to keep on living at all, and got from a South American acquaintance a very curious liquid to take him to oblivion without suffering. Inertia and force of habit, however, caused him to defer action, and he lingered indecisively among thoughts of old times, taking down the strange hangings from his walls and refitting the house as it was in his early boyhood, purple panes, Victorian furniture, and all. With the passage of time he became almost glad he had lingered, for his relics of youth and his cleavage from the world made life and sophistication seem very distant and unreal, so much so that a touch of magic and expectancy stole back into his nightly slumbers. For years those slumbers had known only such twisted reflections of everyday things as the commonest slumbers know, but now there returned a flicker of something stranger and wilder, something of vaguely awesome imminence which took the form of tensely clear pictures from his childhood days, and made him think of little inconsequential things he had long forgotten. He would often awake calling for his mother and grandfather, both in their graves 1/4 of a century. Then one night his grandfather reminded him of the key. The grey old scholar, as vivid as in life, spoke long and earnestly of their ancient line, and of the strange visions of the delicate and sensitive men who composed it. He spoke of the flame-eyed crusader who learnt wild secrets of the Saracens that held him captive, and of the first Sir Randolph Carter who studied magic when Elizabeth was queen. He spoke, too, of that Edmund Carter who had just escaped hanging in the Salem witchcraft, and who had placed in an antique box a great silver key handed down from his ancestors. Before Carter awaked, the gentle visitant had told him where to find that box, that carved oak box of archaic wonder whose grotesque lid no hand had raised for 2 centuries. In the dust and shadows of the great attic he found it, remote and forgotten at the back of a drawer in a tall chest. It was about 1 foot square, and its Gothic carvings were so fearful that he did not marvel no person since Edmund Carter had dared to open it. It gave forth no noise when shaken, but was mystic with the scent of unremembered spices. That it held a key was indeed only a dim legend, and Randolph Carter's father had never known such a box existed. It was bound in rusty iron, and no means was provided for working the formidable lock. Carter vaguely understood that he would find within it some key to the lost gate of dreams, but of where and how to use it his grandfather had told him nothing. An old servant forced the carven lid, shaking as he did so at the hideous faces leering from the blackened wood, and at some unplaced familiarity. Inside, wrapped in a discolored parchment, was a huge key of tarnished silver covered with cryptical arabesques. But of any legible explanation there was none. The parchment was voluminous, and held only the strange hieroglyphs of an unknown tongue written with an antique reed. Carter recognized the characters as those he had seen on a certain papyrus scroll belonging to that terrible scholar of the South who had vanished one midnight in a nameless cemetery. The man had always shivered when he read this scroll, and Carter shivered now. But he cleaned the key, and kept it by him nightly in its aromatic box of ancient oak. His dreams were meanwhile increasing in vividness, and though showing him none of the strange cities and incredible gardens of the old days, were assuming a definite cast whose purpose could not be mistaken. They were calling him back along the years, and with the mingled wills of all his fathers were pulling him towards some hidden and ancestral source. Then he knew he must go into the past and merge himself with old things, and day after day he thought of the hills to the north where haunted Arkham and the rushing Miskatonic and the lonely rustic homestead of his people lay. In the brooding fire of autumn Carter took the old remembered way past graceful lines of rolling hill and stone-walled meadow, distant vale and hanging woodland, curving road and nestling farmstead, and the crystal windings of the Miskatonic, crossed here and there by rustic bridges of wood or stone. At one bend he saw the group of giant elms among which an ancestor had oddly vanished a century and a half before, and shuddered as the wind blew meaningly through them. Then there was the crumbling farmhouse of old Goody-Fowler the Witch, with its little evil windows and great roof sloping nearly to the ground on the north side. He speeded up his car as he passed it, and did not slack until he had mounted the hill where his mother and her fathers before her were born, and where the old white house still looked proudly across the road at the breathlessly lovely panorama of rocky slope and verdant valley, with the distant spires of Kingsport on the horizon, and hints of the archaic, dream-laden sea in the farthest background. Then came the steeper slope that held the old Carter place he had not seen in over 40 years. Afternoon was far gone when he reached the foot, and at the bend halfway up he paused to scan the outspread countryside golden and glorified in the slanting floods of magic poured out by a western sun. All the strangeness and expectancy of his recent dreams seemed present in this hushed and unearthly landscape, and he thought of the unknown solitudes of other planets as his eyes traced out the velvet and deserted lawns shining undulant between their tumbled walls, and clumps of fairy forests setting off far lines of purple hills beyond hills, and the spectral wooded valley dipping down in shadow to dank hollows where trickling waters crooned and gurgled among swollen and distorted roots. Something made him feel that motors did not belong in the realm he was seeking, so he left his car at the edge of the forest, and putting the great key in his coat pocket walked on up the hill. Woods now engulfed him utterly, though he knew the house was on a high knoll that cleared the trees except to the north. He wondered how it would look, for it had been left vacant and untended through his neglect since the death of his strange great-uncle Christopher 30 years before. In his boyhood he had reveled through long visits there, and had found weird marvels in the woods beyond the orchard. Shadows thickened around him, for the night was near. Once a gap in the trees opened up to the right, so that he saw off across leagues of twilight meadow and spied the old Congregational steeple on Central Hill in Kingsport, pink with the last flush of day, the panes of the little round windows blazing with reflected fire. Then, when he was in deep shadow again, he recalled with a start that the glimpse must have come from childish memory alone, since the old white church had long been torn down to make room for the Congregational hospital. He had read of it with interest, for the paper had told about some strange burrows or passages found in the rocky hill beneath. Through his puzzlement a voice piped, and he started again at its familiarity after long years. Old Benijah Corey had been his Uncle Christopher's hired man, and was aged even in those far-off times of his boyhood visits. Now he must be well over 100, but that piping voice could come from no one else. He could distinguish no words, yet the tone was haunting and unmistakable. To think that old Beniji should still be alive. Mr. Randy? Mr. Randy? Warb ye. Do you want to scare your Aunt Marthy plumb to death? Hain't she told ye to keep nigh the place in the arternoon and get back afore dark? Randy. Ran. D. He's the beatenest boy fair runnin' off in the woods I ever see. Half the time a settin' mooneen round that snake den in the upper timber lot. Hey you, Ran? D. Randolph Carter stopped in the pitch darkness and rubbed his hand across his eyes. Something was queer. He had been somewhere he ought not to be, had strayed very far away to places where he had not belonged, and was now inexcusably late. He had not noticed the time on the Kingsport steeple, though he could easily have made it out with his pocket telescope. But he knew his lateness was something very strange and unprecedented. He was not sure he had his little telescope with him, and put his hand in his blouse pocket to see. No, it was not there, but there was the big silver key he had found in a box somewhere. Uncle Chris had told him something odd once about an old unopened box with a key in it, but Aunt Martha had stopped the story abruptly, saying it was no kind of thing to tell a child whose head was already too full of queer fancies. He tried to recall just where he had found the key, but something seemed very confused. He guessed it was in the attic at home in Boston, and dimly remembered bribing Parks with half his week's allowance to help him open the box and keep quiet about it. But when he remembered this, the face of Parks came up very strangely, as if the wrinkles of long years had fallen upon the brisk little cockney. Ran. D. Ran. D. Hi. Hi. Randy. A swaying lantern came around the black bend, and old Benija pounced on the silent and bewildered form of the pilgrim. Durn ye, boy, so thar ye be. Ain't ye got a tongue in your head, that ye can't answer a body? I'd been callin' this half hour, and ye must a heerd me long ago. Don't ye know your Aunt Marthy's all a fidget over your bein' off arter dark? Wait till I tell your Uncle Chris when he gets hum. Ye'd orter know these here woods ain't no fittin' place to be traipsin' this hour. They's things abroad what don't do nobody no good, as my grandsir knowed for me. Come, Mr. Randy, or Hannah won't keep supper no longer. So Randolph Carter was marched up the road where wondering stars glimmered through high autumn boughs, and dogs barked as the yellow light of small-paned windows shone out at the farther turn, and the Pleiades twinkled across the open knoll where a great gambrel roof stood black against the dim west. Aunt Martha was in the doorway, and did not scold too hard when Benija shoved the truant in. She knew Uncle Chris well enough to expect such things of the Carter blood. Randolph did not show his key, but ate his supper in silence and protested only when bedtime came. He sometimes dreamed better when awake, and he wanted to use that key. In the morning Randolph was up early, and would have run off to the upper timber lot if Uncle Chris had not caught him and forced him into his chair by the breakfast table. He looked impatiently around the low, pitched room with the rag carpet and exposed beams and corner posts, and smiled only when the orchard boughs scratched at the leaded panes of the rear window. The trees in the hills were close to him, and formed the gates of that timeless realm which was his true country. Then, when he was free, he felt in his blouse pocket for the key, and being reassured, skipped off across the orchard to the rise beyond, where the wooded hill climbed again to heights above even the treeless knoll. The floor of the forest was mossy and mysterious, and great lichened rocks rose vaguely here and there in the dim light like druid monoliths among the swollen and twisted trunks of a sacred grove. Once in his ascent Randolph crossed a rushing stream whose falls a little way off sang runic incantations to the lurking fauns and Egypans and dryads. Then he came to the strange cave in the forest slope, the dreaded snake den which country folk shunned, and away from which Benija had warned him again and again. It was deep, far deeper than anyone but Randolph suspected, for the boy had found a fissure in the farthermost black corner that led to a loftier grotto beyond, a haunting sepulchral place whose granite walls held a curious illusion of conscious artifice. On this occasion he crawled in as usual, lighting his way with matches filched from the sitting-room match safe, and edging through the final crevice with an eagerness hard to explain even to himself. He could not tell why he approached the farther wall so confidently, or why he instinctively drew forth the great silver key as he did so. But on he went, and when he danced back to the house that night he offered no excuses for his lateness, nor heeded in the least the reproofs he gained for ignoring the noon-tide dinner horn altogether. Now it is agreed by all the distant relatives of Randolph Carter that something occurred to heighten his imagination in his 10th year. His cousin, Ernest B. Aspinwall, Esq. of Chicago, is fully 10 years his senior, and distinctly recalls a change in the boy after the autumn of 1883. Randolph had looked on scenes of fantasy that few others can ever have beheld, and stranger still were some of the qualities which he showed in relation to very mundane things. He seemed, in fine, to have picked up an odd gift of prophecy, and reacted unusually to things which, though at the time without meaning, were later found to justify the singular impressions. In subsequent decades, as new inventions, new names, and new events appeared one by one in the book of history, people would now and then recall wonderingly how Carter had years before let fall some careless word of undoubted connection with what was then far in the future. He did not himself understand these words, or know why certain things made him feel certain emotions, but fancied that some unremembered dream must be responsible. It was as early as 1897 that he turned pale when some traveler mentioned the French town of Belloyen-Santerre, and friends remembered it when he was almost mortally wounded there in 1916, while serving with the Foreign Legion in the Great War. Carter's relatives talk much of these things because he has lately disappeared. His little old servant Parks, who for years bore patiently with his vagaries, last saw him on the morning he drove off alone in his car with a key he had recently found. Parks had helped him get the key from the old box containing it, and had felt strangely affected by the grotesque carvings on the box, and by some other odd quality he could not name. When Carter left, he had said he was going to visit his old ancestral country around Arkham. Halfway up Elm Mountain, on the way to the ruins of the old Carter place, they found his motor set carefully by the roadside, and in it was a box of fragrant wood with carvings that frightened the countrymen who stumbled on it. The box held only a queer parchment whose characters no linguist or paleographer has been able to decipher or identify. Rain had long effaced any possible footprints, though Boston investigators had something to say about evidences of disturbances among the fallen timbers of the Carter place. It was, they averred, as though someone had groped about the ruins at no distant period. A common white handkerchief found among forest rocks on the hillside beyond cannot be identified as belonging to the missing man. There is talk of apportioning Randolph Carter's estate among his heirs, but I shall stand firmly against this course because I do not believe he is dead. There are twists of time and space, of vision and reality, which only a dreamer can divine, and from what I know of Carter I think he has merely found a way to traverse these mazes. Whether or not he will ever come back, I cannot say. He wanted the lands of dream he had lost, and yearned for the days of his childhood. Then he found a key, and I somehow believe he was able to use it to strange advantage. I shall ask him when I see him, for I expect to meet him shortly in a certain dream city we both used to haunt. It is rumored in Ulthar, beyond the river Skye, that a new king reigns on the opal throne of Ilek, Vad, that fabulous town of turrets atop the hollow cliffs of glass overlooking the twilight sea wherein the bearded and finny Nori build their singular labyrinths, and I believe I know how to interpret this rumor. Certainly, I look forward impatiently to the sight of that great silver key, for in its cryptical arabesques there may stand symbolized all the aims and mysteries of a blindly impersonal cosmos. The Lute of Golthoth. Over the desert of Cupernambo and the city Golthoth, named by some the damned, night rose and shook his hoary wings. An evil twilight was creeping across the sky, with multitudinous waxing stars. Hidden bats stirred uneasily in doubtful sleep, and in the painted wagons men lighted incense whose duty it was, and chanted the old songs, as they have always done at evening for the last 4,000 years. For a song and no more creditable reason the painted wagons came to Cupernambo. For though deceitful time has concealed much behind the centuries, still those songs forget not the greatness of Golthoth's limestone temples and obelisks, nor any rumor of the arts whereby the Cyclopean limestone blocks were moved, which is one with the dust of architects. Very splendid still are Golthoth's temples, with their images and myriad columns spectral in that light which filters only at noon down through the shadowy fanes. There by little copper lamps the shaven priests mumbled once over papyrus scrolls before the cryptical gods, strange figures with human bodies and the heads of cats, hawks, rams and lions, and jackal-headed Anubis whose concern is with the dead. But the old gods and kings are unnamed for the last 4,000 years, since a certain thing happened which even the songs dare not hint. Some have surmised a curse which the gods once spoke in anger and could never since recall. But the songs say only how after this certain thing the eyes and glyphic name of Anubis were chipped off the temple walls by the shaven priests, before the priests disappeared, and how people fled their ancient, horrible city, screaming. Now this certain thing was forgotten, for the songs made no mention of it, and the old gods slept. And in cities less ancient and horrible than Golthoth strange, dark wanderers began to think again of the opulence of their ancient kings all lonely in the desert, sentineled only by the lean jackals and their shadows. These people considered how one might spend so many emeralds, and the uses men have for gold. One morning the strange, dark wanderers were gone with their painted wagons from the marketplaces of cities where they told fortunes for silver and bought gay beads from the merchants, which displease no one but the torturers and dispensers of justice who are not kind to thieves. When they came to Cupernambo the high walls were all blue with the evening. Much has been sung of the wealth of the old kings. It was the intention of the dark people to come beneath the high tombs shaped, as was customary, like a pyramid, and to locate therein the hidden door such tombs are known to have. Among their number were several persons for whom familiarity had made the felonious arts of burglary wholly contemptible, and one wearing the headdress with the two horns and a curious disc between the horns, who was not unlearned concerning cold guardians of tombs who have a deplorable appetite for the blood of venturesome thieves, and how most effectively to curb that appetite. Many had mattocks and spades. On Cupernambo, in sight of the beautiful blue walls, the burglars conferred with the priest, who consulted in turn the little ivory fetishes he had, and so determined that the enterprise so dear to all their hearts should begin with the first light of dawn. No one knows when Snid and Leshti and Loth decided upon their own enterprise, but for several days more than one person had missed a spade or mattock from among his personal belongings. For Leshti and Loth were of course both notably fine thieves, but the deeds of Snid have become a matter of fable. Whenever his name is mentioned men stop smiling and look to their shutters. Jewelers who remember what became of the gnome's opals justly fear the deftness of his quick brown fingers. In a certain disreputable quarter of Celephies they wonder how once he appropriated, by means not entirely honest, the 3 unlikely ruby coffers and the key to the vaults of Zin, all in a single night's work. It is therefore not surprising that the plan should have occurred to Snid. And the plan was not at all uncongenial to Messrs. Leshti or Loth. When those 3 conspirators left the watchfires in front of the painted wagons the stars were already out, still nobody saw them steal away into the shadows. Perhaps someone did see a lean, crouching shape slipping suspiciously just past the edge of sight, noticed hardly at all, while elsewhere one overheard the crack of a pebble, or was it only the fire, and a little breeze rattling in the grass. But of course it was neither Snid nor Leshti nor Loth, who were much too subtle, for they had already gotten as far as the secret path which men never made, that goes furtively down along Golthoth's dizzy walls, past the pits there are on the far side, and thence by devious ways down into that valley where the 3 hoped to find and loot the high tomb. They would not enter that ancient, horrible city, for Snid had spent many hours in pondering the old songs and his plan, and it seemed to him not improbable that the old gods who slept might also dream. And Snid had his reasons for not wishing to meet any dream of the gods. So they came, those 3 thieves with their mattocks and spades and the 3 zebras brought for a purpose, which Snid had concealed in his wagon so cunningly that no one even suspected, the zebras on whose backs they hoped to bear away their loot to Drinan, thereby confounding their tribe. So they came down that old forgotten path between the crumbling lesser tombs, and found at last that which of all things the thieves had least reason to expect. The high tomb was not there. So Leshti fell down weeping, and loth would have thrown himself upon his sword. But Snid only sat dejectedly upon a stone, biting his nails and considering how things were not going at all as he had planned. Now it no longer made any difference to Snid why the name and painted eyes of Anubis, and not sinful Nyarlathotep, who has no eyes, were effaced by the vengeful priests, for his reputation was at stake. Nor was he ever one to leave perfectly valuable sapphires lying in a desert. But Snid was having uncomfortable suspicions about what a certain thing that had left Golthoth desolate may have been, and had he not his reputation to think of, he might almost have slipped quietly back to the watchfires before anyone there even realized that Snid had been away. Then avarice got the better of him. Never telling the younger thieves what he feared, he made instead some likely reference to wind and sand and time, for the desert, as he said to Leshti and Loth, was always jealous of his secrets, and there were 4,000 years to be considered. Then those notable thieves took heart, and lighted the copper lanterns they had, knowing that no one who spies strange red lights out in the desert at night is likely to investigate, and unpack their spades and mattocks. And there beneath the stars, under Snid's shrewd direction, they set about their heroic project, the unearthing of the high pyramid tomb which the desert was inhospitably concealing. They worked very quickly in the starlight, driven by sheer avarice. Still Leshti and Loth were not happy as they dug, though when the oddly moist clay began to assume an unhealthy shade that was not reassuring, they said it was only the red beams of their lanterns, and dug stoutly on. The cleverly muffled spades made less noise than their breathing. They heard the jackals draw near with terrible smiles, and heard them whine nervously as they slunk away with their shadows and tails between their legs. But Snid would only scoff at omens. And when the thieves had dug down to the depth of a grave, they uncovered 3 small diorite cubes bearing an exceedingly peculiar inscription on 5 of the 6 polished faces of each, and the sign of the 5-pointed star. These Snid eyed perplexedly for several minutes, then cast from him in revulsion, muttering something about their being of little market value. Still he would not admit that it might be as he feared, for his reputation was at stake. But much later even Snid could not hide his unease, for they all loathed the way that viscid, quivering mud clung to their spades and crept and bubbled noisomely, and the horrible way it ate holes in their boots. Now when evening comes the dark wanderers sing the old songs no longer, and light incense only to conceal a certain terrible odor which has haunted their wagons since the morning, long ago, when they fled from Cupernambo. They have since tried to explain that odor away in view of what they now know to have happened, but of the way the ground beneath the painted wagons behaves at evening they never speak. Once a man admonished them to return to the worship of the old gods who sleep, and to offer sacrifice to Anubis lest the world swallow them as well. But they slew him with a curious rite, and buried him beneath one of the wagons where the ground acted strangely. It is many years since the burgesses of Ulthar have heard any rumor of the Dark Wanderers. This is what the Dark people found on that morning they came down between the crumbling lesser tombs, to the place where they looked to find the high tomb of their heart's desire, a lonely crouching shape that snarled and laughed and scrabbled in the dust, whom they recognized as Snid by the little lines of greed about the eyes. But there was very little human in those eyes now, and even less in the ghoulish aspect of the face. And observing then the spades and mattocks where they had been laid, and the 3 dead zebras, they guessed what Snid had planned, and searched his pockets to learn whether he had found the treasurer of the old kings. But there were only some white finger bones, a number of teeth, and a portion of somebody's femur. They wondered at the freshness of those pitiful osseous relics, and at the hideous way Snid leered at them and laughed, and called them by name. No recognizable traces of Leshti or Loth were ever found. Yet despite these queer portents the Dark people would have begun an excavation of their own. Only after they saw how the earlier digging had not been filled in, as they had supposed, but had closed up in a horrible smile, did they drop their implements and hurry judiciously away. The Insects from Shaggai. By Ramsey Campbell. 1. The Place of the Cone. Perhaps it would be better if I enjoyed myself as best as possible in the next few hours, but somehow I feel bound to write down some explanation for my friends, even if they will not believe it. After all, I am not really depressed. It is only because I must not be alive after sunset that I will slit my wrists then. Already, certainly, my reader will feel incredulity, but it is quite true that my continued existence might be a danger to the whole human race. But no more. I will tell my story from the beginning. When drinking I tend to be boastful and intolerant, so that when I stayed in the hotel in the middle of Brichester I resolved to keep a check on myself, to stay away from the bar, if possible. But one of the residents, a middle-aged teacher who read extensively, had heard of Ronald Shea, and quite liked some of my fantasy stories. So it was that he led me into the bar, with promises that he would tell me all the Severn Valley legends which might form plots for future stories. The first few tales served to get me slightly intoxicated, and then he suddenly started on one which did not sound like the usual witch story. By the end I was forced to admit that it was at least original. In the woods towards Goat's Wood, my informant began, the trees get very thick towards the center. Of course not too many people go down there. There are too many stories about Goat's Wood itself to attract outsiders, but there's a clearing in the middle of the forest. It's supposed to have been cleared by the Romans for a temple to some god of theirs, I think the Magna Mater, but I wouldn't know about that. Anyway, sometime in the 1600s what must have been a meteor fell in the clearing one night. There were quite a few peculiar happenings earlier that night, arcs of light across the sky, and the moon turned red, according to books I've seen. The fall of this meteorite was heard for miles around, but nobody went to investigate. There were attempts to get together a search party in Brichester and Campside, but that petered out. Not long after, people began to go there, but not normal people. The local coven made it their meeting place. On ritual nights they'd consummate the Black Mass there and make blood sacrifices, and before long the country people began to say that the witches didn't even worship Satan anymore, they worshipped the meteorite. Of course, the local clergyman said the thing was probably sent from hell anyway. Nobody could really say they'd seen these rites in the clearing, but a lot of them still said that something came out of the meteor in answer to the witches' prayers. Then someone went down to the clearing, long after Matthew Hopkins had found the coven and had them executed. It was a young man who visited the clearing in daylight on a bet. He didn't come back before dark, and the others began to get worried. He didn't return until after daylight the next morning, and by that time he was completely incoherent, ran screaming into Brichester, and they couldn't get anything out of him. That's where it ends, I suppose, I interrupted. Somebody sees a nameless horror, and can never tell anyone what he saw. You're wrong there, Mr. Shea, contradicted the teacher. This man gradually calmed down, though for a few days he was so quiet that they were afraid he'd been struck dumb. Finally he did calm down enough to answer questions, but a lot was left unexplained. Of course, as you say. Apparently he'd been plowing through the thickest part of the forest when he heard something following him down the path. Very heavy footsteps, he said, with a sort of metallic sound about them. Well, he turned round, but there was a bend in the path that blocked his view. However, the sun was shining down the path, and it cast a shadow of something which must have been just beyond the turning. Nobody knows exactly what it was. The man only said that while it was almost as tall as a tree, it was no tree, and it was moving towards him. I suppose he would have seen it in a moment, but he didn't wait for that. He ran the other way down the path. He must have run for quite some time, I think, because he ended up in the haunted clearing. Quite the last place he'd have chosen. This is the part that rather interests me. The sun was near to setting, and maybe that gave an added luridness to the scene. Anyway, in this glade in the forest he saw a metal cone standing in the center. It was made of gray mineral that didn't reflect, and was more than 30 feet high. There was a kind of circular trapdoor on one side, but on the other side were carved reliefs. Presumably he was frightened to go near it, but finally he approached it. Over at one side of the space, there was a long stone with a rectangular hollow scooped out of the top. It was surrounded by human footprints, and there was dried blood in the hollow. Another hiatus, I'm afraid. He never would describe those carvings on the cone, except to say that some represented the thing he had almost seen on the path, and others were of other things. He didn't look at them long anyway, but went round the other side to look at the trapdoor. It didn't seem to have any lock or way of opening, and he was studying it. Then a shadow fell across him. He looked up. It was only the sun finally setting, but it did attract his attention away from the trapdoor. When he looked back, it was hanging open. And while he watched, he heard a throbbing noise somewhere above him, in the tip of the cone. He said he thought there was a sort of dry rustling inside, getting closer. Then he saw a shape crawling out of the darkness inside the trapdoor. That's about it. What do you mean, that's all there is? I said incredulously. More or less, yes, the teacher agreed. The man became very incoherent after that. All I can learn is that he said it told him about its life, and what it wanted. The legend hints something more, actually, speaks of his being dragged off the earth into other universes, but I wouldn't know about that. He's supposed to have learned the history of these beings in the cone, and some of what's passed down in the legend is remarkably unusual. At sunrise the daytime guardians, that's what they're called in the story, come out, either to warn people away from the clearing or to drive them in there. I don't know which. These were that species of thing that cast the shadow he saw on the path. On the other hand, after dark the others come out of the cone. There was a lot more told him, but the whole thing's very vague. Yes, it is vague, isn't it? I agreed meaningfully. Too vague. Horrors that are too horrible for description, eh? More likely whoever thought this up didn't have enough imagination to describe them when the time came. No, I'm sorry, I won't be able to use it. I'd have to fill in far too much if I did. The thing isn't even based on fact, obviously. It must be the invention of one of the locals. You can see the inconsistencies. If everybody was so scared of this clearing, why did this man suddenly stand up and go into it? Besides, why is the thing so explicit until it reaches any concrete horror? Well, Mr. Shea, remarked my informant, don't criticize it to me. Tell Sam, there, he's one of the locals who knows about these things. In fact, he told me the legend. He indicated an old rustic drinking a pint of beer at the bar, who I had noticed watching us all through the conversation. He now rose from the stool and sat at our table. Ah, Zur, remonstrated our new companion, you don't want to sneer at stories as is told round here. Him as you was about laughed at what they said to him. He didn't believe in ghosts nor devils, but that was before he went to the woods. And I can't tell you more about what he got from the thing in cone cost them as new kept quiet about it. That's not the only one about the clearing in the woods, interposed the teacher. This witch cult which held their meetings there had their reasons. I've heard they got some definite benefit from their visits, some sort of ecstatic pleasure, like that one gets from taking drugs. It had something to do with what happened to the man when he went in, you know, when he seemed to enter another universe. But beyond that, I can't tell you anything. There are other tales, but they're still more vague. One traveler who strayed down there one moonlit night saw what looked like a flock of birds rising out of the glade, but he got a second look, and even though these things were the size of large birds, they were something quite different. Then quite a few people have seen lights moving between the trees and heard a kind of pulsation in the distance. And once they found someone dead on a path through the woods. He was an old man, so it wasn't too surprising that he died of heart failure. But it was the way he looked that was peculiar. He was staring in absolute horror at something down the path. Something had crossed the path just ahead of the corpse, and whatever it was, it must have been enough to stop a man's heart. It had broken off branches more than 15 feet from the ground in passing. We had all been talking so long that I did not realize how much I had drunk. It was certainly with alcoholic courage that I stood up as my two companions stared in amazement. At the door to the staircase I turned, and unthinkingly declared, "I've got some days to spare here, and I don't intend to see you all terrified by these silly superstitions. I'm going into the woods tomorrow afternoon, and when I find this rock formation you're all so scared of, I'll chip a bit off and bring it back so it can be exhibited on the bar." The next morning brought cloudless skies, and up to midday I was glad that the weather could not be construed an ill omen by the innkeeper or similar persons. But around 2 o'clock in the afternoon mist began to settle over the district, and by 2:30 the sun had taken on the appearance of a suspended globe of heated metal. I was to leave at 3 o'clock, for otherwise I would not reach the clearing before dark. I could not back out of my outlined purpose without appearing foolish to those who had heard my boasting. They would certainly think that any argument that the mist would make my progress dangerous was merely an excuse. So I decided to journey a little distance into the forest, then return with the tale that I had been unable to find the clearing. When I reached the wood after driving as fast as was safe in my sports car, the sun had become merely a lurid circular glow in the amorphously drifting mist. The moistly peeling trees stretched in vague colonnades into the distance on both sides of a rutted road. However, the teacher had directed me explicitly, and without too much hesitation I entered the forest between two dripping trees. 2. The Thing in the Mist. There was a path between the tortuous arches, though it was not well defined. Before long the oppressive atmosphere of the tunnel, distorted through the walls of mist, combined with the unfamiliar sounds which occasionally filtered into the ringing silence to produce a disturbing feeling of awed expectancy. What I expected I could not have said, but my mind was full of hints of some impending occurrence of terrible significance. My eyes were strained by my efforts to pierce the drab wall before me. It was not long before this persistent conviction became unbearable, and I told myself this was the time to return to the inn with my prepared excuse, before darkness. The path had had no others meeting it, so that I could easily retrace my journey, even through the mist. That was when I turned to go back down the path, and stopped in indecision. I had almost collided, I thought, with a metallically gray tree. Small in comparison with the average in the forest, this tree was about 16 feet high with very thick cylindrical branches. Then I noticed that the trunk divided into 2 cylinders near the ground, and the lower ends of these cylinders further divided into 6 flat circular extensions. This might merely have been a natural distortion, and such an explanation might also have accounted for the strange arrangement of the branches in a regular circle at the apex of the trunk, but I could not reach for a natural explanation when those branches nearest me suddenly extended clutchingly in my direction, and from the top of what I had taken for a trunk rose a featureless oval, leaning towards me to show an orifice gaping at the top. The mist eddied around me as I ran blindly down the path, which slid from under my feet and twisted away at unpredictable places. I visualized that giant being clumping in pursuit through the forest, its tentacles waving in anticipation, the mouth in the top of that featureless head opening hungrily. The silence of the forest unnerved me. Perhaps the monstrosity was not pursuing me, in which case there must be some yet worse fate ahead. How many of the things might inhabit the forest? Whatever they were, surely they could be no acknowledged species. How could I see if they were waiting in silent ambush? The mist would effectively camouflage them, for a pillar-like blur might merely be another tree. Despair followed upon my terrified imaginings, and finally I fell against a gray oak and awaited whatever terror might come for me. The exhaustion resulting from my frenzied flight dulled the edge of fear, and quite soon I ceased to glare in horror at every sound among the trees. My muscles ached from that mad chase, and muscular weariness soon combined with the tiredness I suddenly felt to produce a troubled sleep. I was soon awakened by a dream that a forest such as that surrounding me had changed to an army of oval-skulled titans, but the sleep had lasted long enough to refresh me. I did not feel thankful for the rest, however. The mist had almost lifted, and because of this I could see that the sun was near to setting. I had to leave the forest quickly. Sleep had not erased the memory of what I had recently seen, and my mind might not take the strain of being alone at night near such prowling lunacies. But I quickly realized that I no longer knew the way out of this maze of terror, even though the surroundings were easily visible. If I went in the wrong direction, I would not know this until dark, when all the lurking haunters of the forest might close in on me. However, it was even more obvious that, since no amount of concentration would show me the route, I must waste no more time in futile debate, but go in one direction, praying that it would lead me out of the nightmare into which I had plunged. A vague intuition suggested that the path to the left was my original route, and I hastily began to walk down it, attempting to silence faint premonitions. There was no recognizable landmark anywhere near the route, although once or twice I thought a distorted oak was familiarly shaped. But, considering that the inward journey had been merely a terrified flight, it was not surprising that I remembered nothing. Occasionally despair overtook me, and I was sure that the faceless colossi of the wood never would let me escape, but I shunned such ideas where possible. Soon my hopes began to rise. Surely the trees were beginning to thin out, and vegetation to become less abundant, as though I were approaching the edge of the forest. It would not be any too soon either, for, from the position of the sun, night could not be more than a quarter of an hour away. And was that not my car that I saw in the distance among the trees? Certainly something gleamed with a flash of dull metal just where the path seemed to end, though as yet I could not make out any details. I hurried towards the furtive gleam on the road, and reached the clearing I had taken for a road. The 30-foot-high metal cone which towered in the clearing reflected the light only because it was covered with moisture, for it was constructed of a dull mineral, pitted and scarred from unimaginable stresses. As yet I could not see the carven side of the cone, and that facing me was bare except for a circular protrusion, surely the trapdoor of the legend. But though those unholy carvings were not then visible, what I could see in the shunned clearing was disturbing enough. There was a roughly rectangular stone at the opposite side, the top surface of which was hollowed out and darkly stained, and the stains appeared fresher than could be healthily explained, although I did not approach to verify the dreadful idea which occurred to me. No marks of feet, nor of anything else, appeared in the muddy earth. What manner of unnatural prints I had expected I do not know, but their absence did not reassure me. I knew that some species of being lurked here in the haunted clearing, and what being made no mark in passing. Though my fear had been great when I came upon the hidden place in the forest, my curiosity combined with a certain fatalism to impel me to examine the cone. After all, it would soon be night, long before I found my way to the edge of the wood. It was useless to flee the beings of the forest when they would be awaiting my attempted escape. In the few minutes which remained to me, I determined to see what was carved on the opposite side of the cone, and so I circled the object, noting a faint dry rustling sound which came from somewhere in the clearing. Immediately I saw the images on the pitted gray expanse. I regretted my wish to view them. I can describe them, and the actions they were shown performing, from which I drew conclusions which were verified dreadfully soon after. But none of these descriptions can convey the sheer abnormality and alienness of those depictions, for the human mind cannot imagine the cosmically unnatural until concrete evidence has been shown undeniably to it. There were 5 distinct races of entities pictured in the reliefs. A species of insect appeared most often, an insect with certain alien characteristics marking it as not of this planet. Often these beings would be manipulating peculiar cylindrical appliances, which seemed to project a thin ray disintegrating whatever lay in its path. Another instrument, a box-shaped crystal emitting a scintillating petal-shaped field, was used to subdue the counterparts of that oval-headed faceless being, which apparently were a race of enslaved workers used to perform tasks requiring strength for the relatively weak insect species. Those were not the only creatures depicted on the surface of the cone, but what use is it to describe them at this point? It was very soon after that I saw such beings in their natural surroundings, and such an experience was infinitely worse than seeing a mere representation of nightmare. It is sufficient to say that the sculptures were so crude as to cloak the more hideous details of the subjects, for more details had been used in the reproduction of the surroundings. The two suns that ceaselessly orbited above the scenes were startlingly realistic, although for sheer alienness even this could not equal the actual scene. The sky-clawing pylons and disturbingly sharp-end domes of the cities frequently looming in the distance were not shown from the inside, nor was the utter horror of the interior of the cone ever portrayed. About then I realized that it was becoming increasingly difficult to see the figures on the cone, and I started in terror, as I realized the sun had set upon my engrossed contemplation. The glade had become dreadfully quiet, stressing the sound of rustling which still emanated from somewhere nearby. That dry sound seemed to come from above, and abruptly it came to me that it was the noise of something coming down inside the cone. Abruptly it ceased, and I tensed, waiting for the thing which would appear around the curved metal at any minute. That it was something which figured in the scenes engraved on that metal I did not doubt, probably one of the omnipotent semi-insect race. But what details of it might blast my mind before the thing fell on me? And it was at that moment that I heard a clanging sound on the opposite side, the sound of the opening of the circular trapdoor. 3. The insects from the cone. That dull noise of the pitted trapdoor beyond my line of vision echoed for a long time, yet when it ceased nothing had appeared around the curve of the cone. All that could be heard was the rustling of the unseen dweller, now mixed with the scrabbling which steadily approached. At last a shape appeared, flapping above the ground on leathery wings. The thing which flew whirring towards me was followed by a train of others, wings slapping the air at incredible speed. Even though they flew so fast, I could, with the augmented perception of terror, make out many more details than I wished. Those huge lidless eyes which stared in hate at me, the jointed tendrils which seemed to twist from the head in cosmic rhythms, the 10 legs, covered with black shining tentacles and folded into the pallid underbody, and the semicircular ridged wings covered with triangular scales. All this cannot convey the soul-ripping horror of the shape which darted at me. I saw the 3 mouths of the thing move moistly, and then it was upon me. I thought it had somehow managed to fly over me, even though the horribly flat face had a moment before been pressed into mine, for I had felt no impact. But when I turned to look behind me, there was no sign of the insect creature, and the landscape was empty. The others from the cone did not attempt to attack me, but flapped away over the trees. My mind a chaos of speculation, I watched them in their flight, attempting to decide where their companion had gone. The next moment the whole landscape seemed to ripple and melt, as if the lenses of my eyes had twisted in agonizing distortion. Then I felt it, the thing which was distorting my impulses to such an extent, the thing which, in some hideous way, had become a parasite, the thing which, at the moment when it flew in my face, had entered my body and was crawling around in my brain. Now, as I look back upon my first sensation of something worming through the corridors of my brain, with a slightly higher degree of objectivity, I can only surmise that the being cannot have been strictly material, constructed of some alien matter which allowed its atoms to exist conterminously with those of my body. But then I could think of nothing but the frightful parasite which crawled where my clawing fingers could not reach. I can only try to speak of the other occurrences of that night with some degree of coherency, for my impressions after that became somewhat confused. It must have been that my mind was growing accustomed to the unholy object in my skull, for, unbelievable as it seems, within a short time I thought of this state as perfectly normal. The being was affecting my very thought processes, and even as I stood before the cone, the insect creature was pouring its memories into me. For as the landscape melted about me, I began to experience visions. I seemed to float above scenes like those of a hashish dream, in a body such as that of the horror from the cone. The world swam out of darkness for what seemed an eternity. I saw things of indescribable hideousness, and could not flee from the sight of them. And as the thing gained a hold over me, I began to see actual scenes from the life of the being which occupied me. There was a place of green mist through which I flapped, over a boundless surface of pitching water. At one point the mists began to roll back, and I rose through them, the green, attenuated film billowing round me. In the distance a long, vague cylinder poked towards the invisible sky, and as I drew closer I saw that it was a stone pillar, protruding from the swaying water, grown with hard shell-like plants and with curiously shaped projections on each side at regular intervals. There seemed to be no reason for the terror which boiled up in me at the sight of that pillar, but I purposely flew around the object at a distance. As the mists began to conceal it again, I saw a huge leathery hand, with long boneless fingers, reach out of the water, followed by a many-jointed arm. I saw that arm's muscles tense, as if whatever owned the arm were preparing to pull itself out of the sea. I turned away and flew into the mist, for I did not want to see what would appear above the surface. The scene melted into another. I crawled down a path which snaked between translucent, diamond-like rocks. The path entered a valley, at the bottom of which lay a strange black building, inexplicably luminous under the purple night sky of that far planet. The building was of no recognizable architecture, with its deliriously sloping roof and many-sided towers, and I did not know why I was approaching it so purposefully. My claws clattered over the rock-strewn surface which became a black-tiled pavement before the gaping entrance to the ebon building, and I entered. Many passages twisted before I reached that which I sought, that which was spoken of on Shaggai as so powerful, and I did not like what hung from the ceilings in shadowy corners. But at last I came upon the windowless chamber in a high black tower. I took the strangely shaped piece of metal from where it lay on a central slab and turned to leave the chamber. Then a door in the opposite wall crashed open, and I remembered the whispered legend of the guardian of this weapon of a lost race. But I knew how to use the weapon's fullest power, and through it I focused mental waves to blast apart the many-legged furry thing which scuttled from the open door, its abominably shrunken heads waving on hairy, scrawny necks. Then I flapped from the haunted lightless tower in terror, clutching the metal weapon, for as I looked back I saw the many-headed thing, all the legs on one side of its body burned away, still dragging itself sideways after me. Again the vision rippled and changed. I stood on a high slab of some beautifully polished plastic, surrounded by lines of the most nauseous beings imaginable. They were oval, two-legged dwarf things, scarcely 2 feet high, without arms or head, but with a gaping moist gray mouth at the center of their bodies, which were of a spongy white pulp. They were all prostrate in an attitude of worship before me on the fungus which appeared to compose the ground in a solid gelatinous sheet on their side of the slab. My side of that slab was bare rock, covered with huge squat dark emerald buildings of the same material as the slab. These, I knew, had been constructed by a race other than the pulpy white things, and probably antedating them. The beings that worshipped my hardness could not work such material or even touch it, but lived in repulsively moist burrows in the fungus. Indeed, even as I watched, one of them moved too near to the dais upon which I stood, and in so doing ripped away a sponge-wet portion of itself, which speedily putrefied where it lay. Yet another scene flashed before me. I skimmed over a plain covered with colossi depicting naked humanoid figures in various bestial attitudes, each statue at least 100 feet tall, and about them all was some hideous detail which I could not quite place. I disliked the vast footprints which led between the leering figures, and still more disliked the disturbingly gnawed bones of huge animals which were strewn across the plain, for I felt that I knew the cause of these horrors, and knew the abnormality of the colossi, if only I could place it. Then came those clumping footsteps behind me, startlingly close, and as I turned and saw what came striding across that field of unholy carvings, I knew the answer to both questions. It was humanoid, almost, as it pounded through the maze of statues, but it towered above the 100-foot figures. And the atrocious thing which I glimpsed as I fled from that shrine to cosmic accidents was the eyelessness of the living colossus, and the way the hair of the scalp grew in the sockets where the eyes should have been. As the visions began to overtake me in greater quantity, they acquired more definite connection, and it was not long before I realized what was now being put into my brain was a sort of history of the insect race. Perhaps the most horrible part of the affair was the way I regarded the events and scenes now presented to me, not with the horror and disgust of a sane human being, but with the exact same impersonal observation of the insect parasite. As the chronicles of the race were passed through my mind, I was, to all purposes, the insect which had become part of me. I write this now with more emotion than when I experienced the memories of the being, and that thought fills me with more terror than did the memories themselves. So it was that I learned the history of the insect race, and so it is that I write now what I learned. And horror can still be provoked in me by thoughts of what the insects from Shaggai may yet do on this earth. 4. The Exodus from the Gulf. The beings had, I learned, originally come from Shaggai, a globe far beyond the reach of any earthly telescope, which orbited a double sun at the edge of the universe. Upon this planet they built their cities, full of globular domes for their habitations and pylons of that gray metal which composed the cone. The main buildings were almost all globular, entered by a doorless orifice at the top of each, through which the insects could fly. But there was one important building which was not globular, but pyramidical, the temple at the center of each city. And the thoughts of the being grew oddly reticent on the subject of this temple, whence all the inhabitants would go to worship at ritual times, for never could I tap a memory of what was worshipped inside that gray metal pyramid. The only fact which became apparent was that, incredible as it sounds, the tenant of the temple was one living being, but was somehow the same being in each temple. The life of the beings of the gray cities followed no definite pattern, except for certain observances. They would leave their domes as the blinding emerald light of the two suns rose above the horizon, and while a generally avoided group of priests flew to the temple, the rest went about personal business. None needed to eat. They lived by photosynthesis of the green rays of the double star, and so they visited other planets, seeking new abnormalities which they, in their perversion, could aesthetically enjoy. At the time of birth of my informant, the race, needing to do no work, had sunk to an abysmal state of decadence. While on Shaggai they would torture slave races from other worlds for pleasure, and when on other planets, they sought the most terribly haunted localities to view their horrors, with which pastime the early memories of the insect being had been occupied. There was another practice of the insects which was not then fully revealed, but it was connected, it appeared, with what they practiced on the witch cult at their outpost on Earth. At any rate, the beings had set up outposts and built cities on many of the outer worlds, in case anything should ever make Shaggai uninhabitable, for they had had experience of what might crawl over the rim of the universe and conquer their world before then. So they were to some extent prepared when a catastrophe did indeed devastate their world, many eons before their advent on Earth. Even at the time when I visited their shrine, they had very little idea of what had really destroyed Shaggai. They had seen it happen from the beginning, but could only explain the cause vaguely, and, having viewed a vision of what they saw for myself, I did not wonder at their puzzlement. It was at the dawning of one of those emerald-lit days that the object was first seen. Above the double disk on the horizon, and slowly approaching their planet, appeared a strange semi-spherical red globe. The edges were indistinct, while the center was a sharply defined point of crimson fire. At that time the approach of the sphere was so unnoticeable that few of the city's inhabitants remarked it, but by the third dawn the object was much nearer, so that the race's scientists began to study it. They decided, after much speculation, that it was not a star or planet, but some species of body which was composed of no recognizable substance. The spectrum was completely unknown, and the substance must have come from a region where conditions were unlike those anywhere in this universe. Because of this vagueness of its identity, they were uncertain of its probable effects on their planet, for the body was heading directly for Shaggai, and should reach it before the suns had set thrice more. On the third day the globe was a huge red glow in the sky, blotting out the green suns and lighting everything with a crimson flame, but no heat emanated from it, and no other evidence of its existence met the insects besides the blood-red light. They were uneasy, for the menacing sphere in the heavens was very disturbing, and therefore many of them visited the triangular temple frequently for private worship. The being in my body had been one of those frequent visitors, and owed its life to being in the temple when the cataclysm struck. It had entered under the arched portal, where a portcullis-like sheet of translucent mineral would fall at any external threat, to protect the tenant inside. As the insect made to leave the temple after that act which it must practice before the tenant of the pyramid, it saw a prolonged crimson flash in the sky, speedily approaching the ground, while at the same time the protective shield crashed down in the temple entrance. The 40 or so other beings which also were at worship clattered to stare through the shield at what was happening in the city outside. As the red glow slowly faded, the buildings became again visible, as did the beings in the streets. The creatures and buildings had changed in some way during the cataclysm, for they glowed with that same crimson light, streaming from inside each. And the light became every moment brighter, changing from red, orange, blinding yellow to white, as the insect beings writhed and clawed at themselves in helpless agony. It was the way in which the temple was fortified that saved those inside. The radiation from the bursting globe was kept from affecting them long enough for them to use certain powers. By some obscure method of teleportation they transported the entire temple, with themselves, to the nearest planet on which they had a colony, the world of the faceless cylindrical beings, called Xyclotl by its inhabitants. As the devastated world of Shaggai faded from outside the shield, the insect creature saw the buildings reel and the inhabitants burst asunder in momentary incandescence. And its last glimpse was of the globes of light which were now all that remained of the lords of Shaggai, as they sank to fill the ground with crimson radiation. Upon their arrival on Xyclotl, the insects called the rest of their race from the other planetary colonies to join them. The faceless horrors of the planet were enslaved by the new ruling race, and because of their great strength and little brain power, were driven to perform all tasks in building the new city of the insects on Xyclotl. These beings, which were subdued by one of the insect's instruments for focusing mind power to promote unpleasant nerve impulses, were naturally carnivorous and, if not enslaved in this way, might have eaten any slow-moving insect. However, it was relatively easy to force them to labor, and under their strivings the city speedily took shape. The insects did not remain on Xyclotl for more than 200 years, during which my informant had reached maturity. The reason for their leaving was one about which it would rather not have thought in detail, having to do with the faceless slaves and their somewhat primitive theology. They believed in a legendary plant race which inhabited the bottom of a sheer-sided pit in the outer regions of the country in which the city lay. The religion of the planet's race demanded that periodic sacrifices be chosen from the race and throw themselves as food to the plant gods in the pit. The insects did not object to this practice, so long as it did not remove so many beings as to draw on their labor force, at least, not until a group of insects followed one of the sacrifices to the pit. After that, however, the tale which the returning party told caused the more superstitious, including my informant, to teleport the temple again, together with a number of the race from Xyclotl as a means of labor, to a planet at the center of the next galaxy. The insect being which was pouring its memories into my brain had not actually seen what had occurred in the pit, so was not so explicit as usual, but what it remembered having heard was certainly disturbing. The returning party had seen the faceless creature leap from the edge of the pit and fall towards the abysmal darkness of the lower regions. Then came a splashing in that darkness, and a huge purple moist blossom rose from it, its petals opening and closing hungrily. But the greatest abnormality of the thing which splashed out of the pit was its green tentacles, tipped with many-fingered hands of unholy beauty, which it held yearningly towards the point where the sacrifices threw themselves off. The temple was positioned next at the center of a city on that planet in the next galaxy, an uninhabited planet, it seemed, which the insect colonists named Dagon. They stayed here less than a year, for before they had been there 10 months, they noticed a steady decrease in the number of slaves on the planet, and learned that the beings had been disappearing after dark, though none was ever seen to leave. When 2 insect beings disappeared on successive nights, a party left the city next day to search, and some miles beyond the colony they discovered a huge stretch of marshy ground, at the center of which lay a vast stone tower, from which led suggestively recent-looking footprints to a black object at the edge of the marsh. And when the black object was seen to be a neat pile, composed of the severed heads of the insects together with their bodies, and when they saw that all the flesh had been sucked out through the gaping gash where the heads should have been, the party were not slow in returning to the city and demanding the speedy removal of the temple from Dagon. After the quitting of Dagon, the insects established themselves on a planet which the inhabitants knew as Lgyhx, and which is called Uranus here on Earth. This world became the home of the insects for many centuries. For the native race of Cubid, many-legged metal beings was not openly hostile, but allowed them to build their usual outpost with the labor of the beings from Cthulhu. They built a new temple, the old one having grown dilapidated with so much traveling, and fashioned it in a conical shape, carefully constructing the multidimensional gate which must exist in each temple to allow the entry of that which my informant passed off as that from outside. The city flourished, and the beings native to Lgyhx gradually came to accept the insects as a race ruling the planet jointly with themselves. The only thing for which the natives did not care was the insects worshipping the hideous god Azathoth. They themselves were worshippers of the relatively insignificant deity Lrog, which conferred benefits on its worshippers and demanded only annual sacrifice, in the shape of the removal of the legs of a conscious native. The Cubid beings disliked the vague tales of atrocities practiced on still-living victims in the conical temple of Azathoth, and when a rebellious set of natives began to visit the insect city to worship there, the elders of Lgyhx felt that steps should be taken to prevent such unwelcome infiltrations into their theology. But while they did not fear the weapons of the insect race, they did not like to incur the wrath of the idiot god, and finally decided to do nothing. Some years passed, during which two major sequences of events happened. While a steady hate grew in the majority of the insects for the obscene rites of Azathoth, and a desire for the easy rituals prescribed for Lrog's worshippers began to rise, the rebels set among the natives grew steadily more fervent in their prostrations before the new god and their hate for their natural god. At last these two feelings publicized themselves at the same time. This double revelation came when a particularly fervent group of native Azathoth worshippers violated a temple, smashing all the statues of the two-headed bat deity Lrog and killing 3 of the priests. After acid had been poured into the brains of the offenders, the chief priests of Lrog declared that the temple of Azathoth must be removed altogether from the planet, together with its insect worshippers, although the insects who would conform to the planetary religion might remain if they wished. The Cubid natives who had become believers in the creed of Azathoth were all treated in the same way as the original offenders. As an example, only about 30 of the race from Shaggai left in the temple, but teleporting it in unison they managed to bring it down on a nearby planet, Earth. They made an imperfect materialization in the clearing near Goat's Wood, leaving the best part of the temple underground, and only 30 feet protruding above the surface. In the top of the cone the insects lived, while in the central portion the beings from Cthulhu were stabled. In the lower 40-foot portion was kept that which they worshipped in the temple. During daylight the insects worshipped the tenant of the secret portion of the fane, but after dark they went forth to carry on an insidious campaign to hypnotize selected subjects and lure them to the clearing. From these hypnotized subjects was formed that decadent witch cult which grew up around the temple in the clearing. The members of the coven did not merely visit the clearing to worship and sacrifice persons on the altar there. They went there to experience the obscene pleasure of allowing the insects to inject their memories into their brains, which they enjoyed in the same way a drug addict gains pleasure from his induced delirium. And at that moment, God help me, I was experiencing the same sensations, and doing nothing to shake them off. As the witch cult grew, the insects began to form a plan. Whereas at the beginning they merely lured humans to their haven in order to explore the perversions of their subconscious for pleasure, they gradually came to the conclusion that, if they handled their victims the right way, they would become the new rulers of the planet. First they could overpower the inhabitants of the nearby countryside and then, as they themselves propagated, the whole of the planet. The humans might either be destroyed utterly or retained as a subsidiary labor force, while the newly revealed insect race would build cities and temples, and finally, perhaps, the huge multidimensional gate which alone will let Azathoth into this universe in his original form. thus the final purpose of the cult was shaped. It thus came as a great blow when the local coven was persecuted for witchcraft, and all members executed. Worse still, the word got round that the clearing was connected in an unholy manner with this witchcraft, so that those who lived anywhere near it quickly moved to more wholesome surroundings. The insects would have been able to teleport, had it not been for some constituent of the atmosphere which prevented this. The same unallowed for obstacle made it impossible for the beings to fly any great distance. They therefore declined, using the beings from Xyztlatl, which, because of their guarding the clearing in daylight while the insects worshipped, they called the equivalent in their language of the daytime guardians, to drive unwary wanderers in the woods into the glade. The few they managed to lure to the cone they attempted to use as the foundation of the new cult which they tentatively planned, but without success. That young man of whose visit to the clearing the legend told had been the first in many years, and had been such an unwilling subject that attempts to force him into submission led only to his complete insanity. After his visit, the only person actually to be taken over by one of the insect parasites had been myself. And so the history of the insects from Shaggai had been brought into the present. For the minute I wondered what memories the being in my cranium would now let flow into my brain, but almost immediately afterwards I knew what I was next to see. The insect had decided to make the supreme revelation. It was going to unveil one of its hidden memories of a visit to the lower regions of the temple. Immediately the creature was in the tip of the cone, lying on a gray metal slab in its quarters. It was awakening at that moment, sensing the rise of the sun outside, and it then extended its legs and clattered off the slab, over to the sliding door. It inserted its leg tip into one of the pits in the door and slid it back, turning to look back at the bare semicircular chamber, and the flashing light over the slab, set where it would hypnotize the slab's occupant to immediate sleep. The insect joined the ritual procession of its fellows which were preparing to descend into the lower regions. Those at the head carried long pointed rods of that inevitable gray metal, while the rest held portions of the corpse of a native of Xyztlatl. The rods, it seemed, were to drive the secret tenant of the temple back when it became too desirous of sacrifice. The only victim to be offered it would be the dismembered faceless being, a member of the labor force which had grown too weak to be of further use. Adjusting their weapons, the leaders of the procession moved off down the spiral down-slanting passage. The creature, staring fixedly ahead as prescribed, followed them, carrying a group of severed tentacles as offering. They passed down the gray corridor, not noting the daily seen bas-reliefs on the walls, representing the denizens of caves and ruins on far worlds. Nor did they turn in passing the cells of the Xyztlatl labor force, even when the beings in them crashed themselves against the doors and extended their tentacles in helpless fury upon sensing the portions of their fellow slave. They did not turn when they clattered through the souvenir room, where they kept the preserved eyeless corpse of one specimen from each race subject to them. The first halt in their ritual march was at the carven door of the inner sanctum of the temple, over which certain representations leered down, at which every member of the procession folded its wing case and prostrated itself for a moment. Then the foremost insect creature extended its jointed antenna and gripped a projection on the surface of the door, hesitating a ritual instant, while its three mouths spoke three alien words in unison, and then slid the door open. The first object which came into view beyond the sliding panel was a squat 20-foot statue, a hideously detailed figure which resembled nothing remotely humanoid, and the information was immediately injected into my brain that this object represented the god Azathoth, as he had been before his exile outside. But the eyes of my informant speedily swung away from the alien colossus to the vast door behind it, a door bordered with miniature representations of insect beings, all indicating something beyond that door. And the leaders picked up their pointed weapons and approached the final door, followed by the forward-staring procession. One of the leaders now raised his rod in a curious gesture, while the others prostrated themselves in a semicircle before the bordered door, writhing their antennae in concerted and vaguely disturbing rhythms. Then, as the prostrate crescent rose again, the other leader put forth his tendrils and clasped a projection on the door. Unhesitatingly he drew the portal open. 5. Beyond the final door. I was alone in the glade, lying in the dew-wet grass before the cone. There was no sign of any living being in the clearing besides myself, not even of the being which, I felt certain, had just withdrawn from my brain. The whole glade was exactly as it had been when I entered it, except for one important difference, that the sun had not yet risen. For this meant that the inhabitants of the cone would still be absent from it, searching for victims, and it meant that I could enter the untenanted temple and open that bordered door, on whose opening the insect's memory had ended. If I had been able to think without external hindrance, I would immediately have realized that the memory had ended at that point simply as a subtle method of luring me to the underground sanctum. It is less likely that I would have realized that I was being directed to do this by the being which still inhabited my brain. But I still clung to the possibility that I had been dreaming. There was only one way to find out. I must enter the cone and see what lay behind that final door. So I made for the circular entrance in the gray wall of the cone. Beyond the foot-long passage inside the trapdoor, a diagonally slanting metal corridor led upward and downward. Upward, I guessed, lay the semicircular quarters of the insect beings, where I had no wish to go. Downward lay the temple proper. I started downward, doing my best to avoid looking at the abnormal bas-reliefs which covered the walls. The passage was less strongly lit than it had seemed in the being's memory, so that at first I did not notice the point where the bas-reliefs ended and a line of doors, containing heavy grills, began. Not until a gray metal tentacle whipped through a grill to quiver within an inch of my face did I realize that here was the passage of the Cthylla labor force cells. I cowered back, trembling, to edge along the opposite wall, jerking at the frequent infuriated crashings of the faceless beings against their cell doors, and yearning for the end of the journey. I finally passed the last locked portal and continued on down the spiraling ramp. The memory of the injected recollections of the insect creature was already dimming, so that I could hardly explain the premonition I felt a little further on. I gasped in shock when I rounded a curve and saw an eyeless figure standing with bony arms reaching, all the more hideous because, although the corpse was otherwise human, there were 3 arms held out. The unwavering posture which the thing held gave me the courage to approach it, as I suddenly remembered the vision of the room where the insects kept preserved specimens of their subjects. What sphere had spawned this object I did not think, nor did I linger to stare at the corpse, but passed by quickly between the others. I attempted not to look aside at what I hurried by, but my eyes persisted in straying to things, a frog flipper attached to a tendrilled arm in one place, an insanely situated mouth in another, so that I was very relieved to quit that room. When I came to the temple door and saw that it stood open, I hesitated expectantly. Glancing only once at the metal heads which leered, all joined to one body, over the open portal, I entered. I stopped short, for the memory of that huge image of Azathoth had grown dim. I did not look long at it. I would only have seen worse details with every glimpse, and the first view was bad enough. I will not describe everything about it, but basically it consisted of a bivalvular shell supported on many pairs of flexible legs. From the half-opened shell rose several jointed cylinders, tipped with polypus appendages, and in the darkness inside the shell I thought I saw a horrible bestial, mouthless face, with deep-sunk eyes and covered with glistening black hair. I almost turned and fled from the temple, thinking of the door that lay beyond the statue, and speculating over what the idiot god might now resemble. But I had come this far unharmed, and, noticing the sharpened rods propped against the base of the idol, I did not think that whatever lay beyond the bordered door could harm me. And so, conquering my revulsion at what leered frozenly above, I took up one of the weapons and made for that door. As I reached for the protrusion on the sliding gray panel I hesitated, for I heard a curious sound inside the hidden room, like the washing of the sea against black piles. It ceased immediately, but for some minutes I could not bring myself to draw the door open. In what form would Azathoth manifest itself? Might there not be some reason why the being was only worshipped during daylight? But all the while my hand was moving towards the projection, almost as though another will besides my own were directing it, so that when it dragged the sanctum door open, I battled to stop its progress. but by then the door was completely open, and I was standing staring at what lay beyond. A long passage of the omnipresent grey metal stretched away for 10 feet or so, and at its end stood, on first glance, a blank wall. Yet not quite blank, for a little way up there was a triangular metal door with a bar held across it in brackets. The passage was deserted, but from beyond the triangular door came a sound which I had remarked before, a liquid rolling. I had to know the secret of the temple, and so stealthily approached the door and lifted the bar, which grated slightly. I did not open the door, but backed down the passage and stood at the other end. The wave sound was rising now, as if something at the other side was approaching. Then the triangular portal began to rattle in its frame, and slowly it moved outward on its hinges. And as I saw that metal triangle shifting with pressure from the other side, a wave of terror engulfed me. I did not want to see what lay on the other side of the door, and I turned and slammed the outer door without giving myself time to think. Even as I did so, a grating sound reverberated down the passage and the triangular door crashed open. Through the crack as I slammed the door I saw something ooze into the corridor, a pale gray shape, expanding and crinkling, which glistened and shook gelatinously as still-moving particles dropped free. But it was only a glimpse, and after that it is only in nightmares that I imagine I see the complete shape of Azathoth. I fled from the pyramid then. It was just daylight, and over the trees black shapes were flapping home. I plunged through the corridors of trees, and at one point one of the beings from Cthylla started out into my path. What was worse, it drew back at my approach. Though some of my possessions were left in my room there, I never returned to the inn at Brichester, and no doubt they still speak of me there as having died horribly. I thought that in this way I could make sure the insects could not harm me, but the first night after the experience in the clearing, I felt again that crawling in my brain. Since then I have frequently caught myself seeking persons gullible enough to be lured to the clearing, but always I have been able to fight off such impulses. I do not know how long I can continue to fight, and so I am going to use the one method to end this unholy preying on my mind. The sun has sunk below the horizon now, leaving only a lurid glow which shines on the razor lying on the table before me. Perhaps it is only imagination which makes me seem to feel a restless, blinding stirring in my brain. At any rate, I must hesitate no longer. It may be that the insects will eventually overpower the world, but I will have done all that is possible for me to do to prevent the release of that whose shape I once glimpsed, and which still awaits impatiently the opening of the multidimensional gate. Hey everyone, welcome back to Cosmic and Body Horror, the channel where I explore the dark and twisted side of fiction and reality. Today I have something different for you. I want to share with you a video from my new channel, Stories from the East, where I retell the classic tales from the Arabian Nights. If you are a fan of magic, adventure, romance and mystery, you will love these stories. In this video, you will hear the story of Shahryar and Shahrazad and the merchant and the efrit. It's a story within a story within a story, and it will keep you on the edge of your seat. So sit back, relax and enjoy the show. And if you like what you see, please consider subscribing and supporting my new channel. It would mean a lot to me. Also, if you like the intro music, I upload the full soundtrack on my other channel. I will put links in the description. Thank you and let's get started. Among the histories of past peoples, a story is told that in the old days in the islands of India and China there was a Sasanian king, a master of armies, guards, servants and retainers, who had two sons, an elder and a younger. Although both of them were champion horsemen, the elder was better than his brother. He ruled over the lands, treating his subjects with justice and enjoying the affection of them all. His name was King Shahryar, while his younger brother, who ruled Persian Samarkand, was called Shah-Zaman. For 10 years both of them continued to reign justly, enjoying pleasant and untroubled lives, until Shahryar felt a longing to see Shah-Zaman, and sent off his vizier to fetch him. "To hear is to obey," said the vizier, and after he had traveled safely to Shah-Zaman, he brought him greetings and told him that his brother wanted a visit from him. Shah-Zaman agreed to come and made his preparations for the journey. He had his tents put up outside his city, together with his camels, mules, servants and guards, while his own vizier was left in charge of his lands. He then came out himself, intending to leave for his brother's country, but at midnight he thought of something that he had forgotten and went back to the palace. When he entered his room, it was to discover his wife in bed with a black slave. The world turned dark for him, and he said to himself, "If this is what happens before I have even left the city, what will this damned woman do if I spend time away with my brother?" So he drew his sword and struck, killing both his wife and her lover as they lay together, before going back and ordering his escort to move off. When he got near to Shahryar's city, he sent off messengers to give the good news of his arrival, and Shahryar came out to meet him and greeted him delightedly. The city was adorned with decorations and Shahryar sat talking happily with him, but Shah-Zaman remembered what his wife had done, and, overcome by sorrow, he turned pale and showed signs of illness. His brother thought that this must be because he had had to leave his kingdom, and so he put no questions to him until, some days later, he mentioned these symptoms to Shah-Zaman, who told him, "My feelings are wounded," but did not explain what had happened with his wife. In order to cheer him up, Shahryar invited him to come with him on a hunt, but he refused and Shahryar set off by himself. In the royal palace there were windows that overlooked Shahryar's garden, and as Shah-Zaman was looking, a door opened and out came 20 slave girls and 20 slaves, in the middle of whom was Shahryar's very beautiful wife. They came to a fountain where they took off their clothes and the women sat with the men. "Masudi," the queen called, at which a black slave came up to her and, after they had embraced each other, he lay with her, while the other slaves lay with the slave girls and they spent their time kissing, embracing, fornicating and drinking wine until the end of the day. When Shah-Zaman saw this, he told himself that what he had suffered was less serious. His jealous distress ended, and, after convincing himself that his own misfortune was not as grave as this, he went on eating and drinking, so that when Shahryar returned and the brothers greeted one another, Shahryar saw that Shah-Zaman's color had come back. His face was rosy and, following his earlier loss of appetite, he was eating normally. "You were pale, brother," Shahryar said, "but now you have got your color back, so tell me about this." "I'll tell you why I lost color," his brother replied, "but don't press me to tell you how I got it back." "Let me know first how you lost it, and became so weak," Shahryar asked him, and his brother explained, "When you sent your vizier to invite me to visit you, I got ready and had gone out of the city when I remembered a jewel that was intended as a present for you, which I had left in my palace. I went back there to find a black slave sleeping in my bed with my wife, and it was after I had killed them both that I came on to you. I was full of concern about the affair, and this was why I became pale and sickly. But don't make me say how I recovered." Shahryar, however, pressed him to do this, and so Shah Zaman finally told him all that he had seen. "I want to see this with my own eyes," said Shahryar, at which Shah Zaman suggested that he pretend to be going out hunting again, and then hide with him so that he could test the truth by seeing it for himself. Shahryar immediately announced that he was leaving to hunt. The tents were taken outside the city, and the king himself went out and took his seat in one of them, telling his servants that nobody was to be allowed in to visit him. Then secretly he made his way back to the palace where his brother was and sat down by the window overlooking the garden. After a while the slave girls and their mistress came there with the slaves, and they went on acting as Shah Zaman had described until the call for the afternoon prayer. Shahryar was beside himself and told his brother, "Come, let us leave at once. Until we can find someone else to whom the same kind of thing happens, we have no need of a kingdom, and otherwise we would be better dead." They left by the postern gate and went on for some days and nights until they got to a tall tree in the middle of a meadow, where there was a spring of water by the seashore. They drank from the spring and sat down to rest, but after a time the sea became disturbed and from it emerged a black pillar, towering up into the sky and moving towards the meadow. This sight filled the brothers with alarm, and they climbed up to the top of the tree to see what was going to happen. What then appeared was a tall genie, with a large skull and a broad breast, carrying a chest on his head. He came ashore and went up to sit under the tree on top of which the brothers were hiding. The genie then opened the chest, taking from it a box, and when he had opened this too, out came a slender girl, as radiant as the sun, who fitted the excellent description given by the poetess. She shone in the darkness, and day appeared as the trees shed brightness over her. Her radiance makes suns rise and shine, while, as for moons, she covers them in shame. When veils are rent and she appears, all things bow down before her. As lightning flashes from her sanctuary, a rain of tears floods down. The genie looked at her and said, "Mistress of the nobly born, whom I snatched away on your wedding night, I want to sleep for a while." He placed his head on her knee and fell asleep, while she, for her part, looked up at the tree, on top of which were the two kings. She lifted the genie's head from her knee and put it on the ground, before gesturing to them to come down, and not to fear him. "For God's sake, don't make us do this," they told her. But she replied, "Unless you come, I'll rouse him against you and he will put you to the cruelest of deaths." This so alarmed them that they did what they were told, and she then said, "Take me as hard as you can or else I'll wake him up." Shahryar said fearfully to his brother, "Do as she says." But Shah Zaman refused, saying, "You do it first." They started gesturing to each other about this, and the girl asked why, repeating, "If you don't come up and do it, I'll rouse the genie against you." Because they were afraid, they took turns to lie with her, and when they had finished, she told them to get up. From her pocket she then produced a purse from which she brought out a string on which were hung 570 signet rings. She asked them if they knew what these were, and when they said no, she told them, "All these belong to lovers of mine who cuckolded this genie, so give me your own rings." When they had handed them over, she went on, "This genie snatched me away on my wedding night and put me inside a box, which he placed inside this chest, with its 7 heavy locks, and this, in turn, he put at the bottom of the tumultuous sea with its clashing waves." What he did not know was that, when a woman wants something, nothing can get the better of her, as a poet has said. Do not put your trust in women or believe their covenants. Their satisfaction and their anger both depend on their private parts. They make a false display of love, but their clothes are stuffed with treachery. Take a lesson from the tale of Joseph, and you will find some of their tricks. Do you not see that your father, Adam, was driven out from Eden thanks to them? Another poet has said, "Blame must be matched to what is blamed. I have grown big, but my offense has not. I am a lover, but what I have done is only what men did before me in old days. What is a cause for wonder is a man whom women have not trapped by their allure." When the two kings heard this, they were filled with astonishment, and said to each other, "Genie though he may be, what has happened to him is worse than what happened to us, and it is not something that anyone else has experienced." They left the girl straight away and went back to Shahryar's city, where they entered the palace and cut off the heads of the queen, the slave girls and the slaves. Every night for the next 3 years, Shahryar would take a virgin, deflower her and then kill her. This led to unrest among the citizens. They fled away with their daughters until there were no noble girls left in the city. Then, when the vizier was ordered to bring the king a girl as usual, he searched but could not find a single one, and had to go home empty-handed, dejected and afraid of what the king might do to him. This man had 2 daughters, of whom the elder was called Shahrazad and the younger Dunyazad. Shahrazad had read books and histories, accounts of past kings and stories of earlier peoples, having collected, it was said, 1,000 volumes of these, covering peoples, kings and poets. She asked her father what had happened to make him so careworn and sad, quoting the lines of a poet. "Say to the careworn man, care does not last, and as joy passes, so does care." When her father heard this, he told her all that had happened between him and the king from beginning to end, at which she said, "Father, marry me to this man. Either I shall live or else I shall be a ransom for the children of the Muslims, and save them from him." "By God," he exclaimed, "you are not to risk your life." She insisted that it had to be done, but he objected, "I'm afraid that you may experience what happened to the donkey and the bull with the merchant." "What was that?" she asked, "and what happened to the 2 of them?" Her father told her, "You must know, my daughter, that a certain merchant had both wealth and animals and had been given by Almighty God a knowledge of the languages of beasts and birds. He lived in the country, and had at home a donkey and a bull. One day the bull went to the donkey's quarters and found them swept out and sprinkled with water. There was sieved barley and straw in his trough, while the donkey was lying there at his ease. At times his master would ride him out on some errand, but he would then be taken back. One day the merchant heard the bull say to the donkey, 'I congratulate you. Here am I tired out, while you are at your ease, eating sieved barley. On occasion the master puts you to use, riding on you but then bringing you back again, whereas I am always plowing and grinding corn.' The donkey replied, 'When they put the yoke on your neck and want to take you out to the fields, don't get up, even if they beat you, or else get up and then lie down again. When they bring you back and put beans down for you, pretend to be sick and don't eat them. For 1, 2 or 3 days neither eat nor drink and you will have a rest from your hard labor.' The next day, when the herdsman brought the bull his supper, the creature only ate a little, and next morning, when the man came to take the bull out to do the plowing, he found him sick and said sadly, this was why he could not work properly yesterday. He went to the merchant and told him, 'Master, the bull is unwell and didn't eat any of his food yesterday evening.' The merchant realized what had happened and said, 'Go and take the donkey to do the plowing all day in his place.' When the donkey came back in the evening after having been used for plowing all day, the bull thanked him for his kindness in having given him a day's rest, to which the donkey, filled with the bitterest regret, made no reply. The next morning, the herdsman came and took him out to plow until evening, and when the donkey got back, his neck had been rubbed raw and he was half dead with tiredness. When the bull saw him, he thanked and praised him, but the donkey said, 'I was sitting at my ease, but was unable to mind my own business.' Then he went on, 'I have some advice to give you. I heard our master say that, if you don't get up, you are to be given to the butcher to be slaughtered, and your hide is to be cut into pieces. I am afraid for you, and so I have given you this advice.' When the bull heard what the donkey had to say, he thanked him and said, 'Tomorrow I'll go out with the men.' He then finished off all his food, using his tongue to lick the manger. While all this was going on, the merchant was listening to what the animals were saying. The next morning, he and his wife went out and sat by the byre as the herdsman arrived and took the bull out. When the bull saw his master, he flourished his tail, farted and galloped off, leaving the man laughing so much that he collapsed on the ground. His wife asked why, and he told her, "I was laughing because of something secret that I saw and heard, but I can't tell you or else I shall die." "Even if you do die," she insisted, "you must tell me the reason for this." He repeated that he could not do it for fear of death, but she said, "You were laughing at me," and she went on insisting obstinately until she got the better of him. In distress, he summoned his children and sent for the Qadi and the notaries with the intention of leaving his final instructions before telling his wife the secret and then dying. He had a deep love for her, she being his cousin and the mother of his children, while he himself was 120 years old. When all his family and his neighbors were gathered together, he explained that he had something to say to them, but that if he told the secret to anyone, he would die. Everyone there urged his wife not to press him and so bring about the death of her husband and the father of her children, but she said, "I am not going to stop until he tells me, and I shall let him die." At that, the others stayed silent while the merchant got up and went to the bier to perform the ritual ablution, after which he would return to them and die. The merchant had a cock and 50 hens, together with a dog, and he heard the dog abusing the cock and saying, "You may be cheerful, but here is our master about to die." When the cock asked why this was, the dog told him the whole story. "By God," exclaimed the cock, "he must be weak in the head. I have 50 wives and I keep them contented and at peace while he has only one but still can't keep her in order. Why doesn't he get some mulberry twigs, take her into a room and beat her until she either dies or repents and doesn't ask him again?" The vizier now said to his daughter Shahrazad, "I shall treat you as that man treated his wife." "What did he do?" she asked, and he went on. When he heard what the cock had to say to the dog, he cut some mulberry twigs and hid them in a room, where he took his wife. "Come," he said, "so that I can speak to you in here and then die with no one looking on." She went in with him, and he locked the door on her and started beating her until she fainted. "I take it all back," she then said, and she kissed his hands and feet, and after she had repented she and her husband went out to the delight of their family and the others there. They lived in the happiest of circumstances until their deaths. Shahrazad listened to what her father had to say, but she still insisted on her plan, and so he decked her out and took her to King Shahryar. She had given instructions to her younger sister, Dunyazad, explaining, "When I go to the king, I shall send for you. You must come, and when you see that the king has done what he wants with me, you are to say, 'Tell me a story, sister, so as to pass the waking part of the night. I shall then tell you a tale that, God willing, will save us.'" Shahrazad was now taken by her father to the king, who was pleased to see him and said, "Have you brought what I want?" When the vizier said yes, the king was about to lie with Shahrazad, but she shed tears, and when he asked her what was wrong, she told him, "I have a young sister, and I want to say goodbye to her." At that, the king sent for Dunyazad, and when she had embraced Shahrazad, she took her seat beneath the bed, while the king got up and deflowered her sister. They then sat talking, and Dunyazad asked Shahrazad to tell a story to pass the waking hours of the night. "With the greatest pleasure," replied Shahrazad, "if our cultured king gives me permission." The king was restless, and when he heard what the sisters had to say, he was glad at the thought of listening to a story, and so he gave his permission to Shahrazad. Shahrazad said, "I have heard, O fortunate king, that a wealthy merchant, who had many dealings throughout the lands, rode out one day to settle a matter of business in one of them. When it became hot, he sat down under a tree and put his hand in his saddlebag, from which he took out a piece of bread and a date. He ate, and when he had finished with the date he threw away its stone, at which a huge efrit appeared, with a drawn sword in his hand. This efrit came up to the merchant, and said, 'Get up so that I can kill you as you killed my son.' 'How did I kill your son?' asked the merchant, and the efrit told him, 'When you ate that date and threw away the stone, it struck my son in the chest as he was walking, and he died instantly.' 'We belong to God and to him do we return,' recited the merchant, adding, 'There is no might and no power except with God, the exalted, the omnipotent. If I killed him, this was by accident, so please forgive me.' I must kill you, insisted the efrit, and he dragged off the merchant, threw him down on the ground and raised his sword to strike. With tears in his eyes, the merchant exclaimed, I entrust my affair to God, and he then recited these lines. Time is 2 days, one safe and one of peril, and our lives are of 2 halves, one fair, one overcast. Say to those who reproach us for what time has done, does time oppose any but great men? Do you not see that when the storm winds blow, it is the tall trees that they strike? Corpses rise to the surface of the sea, while it is in its depths that pearls lie hid. It may be that time will mishandle us, subjecting us to constant harm. Though in the heavens there are countless stars, only the sun and moon suffer eclipse. There are both green and dry boughs on the earth, but we throw stones only at those with fruit. You think well of the days when they are fine, so do not fear the evil that fate brings. When he had finished, the efrit said, Stop talking, for, by God, I am most certainly going to kill you. Efrit, the merchant said, I am a wealthy man, with a wife and children. I have debts and I hold deposits, so let me go home and give everyone their due before returning to you at the start of the new year. I shall take a solemn oath and swear by God that I shall come back to you and you can then do what you want with me. God will be the guarantor of this. The efrit trusted him and let him go, after which he went home, settled all his affairs, and gave everyone what was owed them. He told his wife and children what had happened, gave them his injunctions and stayed with them until the end of the year, when he got up, performed the ritual ablution and, with his shroud under his arm, said goodbye to his family and all his relations as well as his neighbors, and set off reluctantly, while they all wept and wailed. He came to the orchard on what was New Year's Day, and as he sat there weeping over his fate, a very old man approached him, leading a gazelle on a chain. The newcomer greeted him and asked him why he was sitting there alone, when the place was a haunt of jinn. The merchant told the story of his encounter with Efrit, and the old man exclaimed, By God, brother, you are a very pious man and your story is so wonderful that were it written with needles on the corners of men's eyes, it would be a lesson for those who take heed. He took his seat by the merchant's side and promised not to leave until he had seen what happened to him with Efrit. As the two of them sat there talking, the merchant was overcome by an access of fear together with ever-increasing distress and apprehension. It was at this point that a second old man arrived, having with him 2 black Seleucus. After greeting the 2 men, he asked them why they were sitting in this haunt of jinn, and they told him the story from beginning to end. No sooner had he sat down with them than a third old man, with a dappled mule, came up, greeted them and asked why they were there, at which they repeated the whole story, but there is no point in going over it again. As soon as the newcomer had sat down, a huge dust devil appeared in the middle of the desert, clearing a way to show the efrit with a drawn sword in his hand and sparks shooting from his eyes. He came up to the 3, dragged the merchant from between them and said, Get up so that I can kill you as you killed my beloved son. The merchant sobbed and wept, while the 3 old men shed tears, wailed and lamented. Then the first of them, the man with the gazelle, left the others, kissed the efrit's hand and said, Jinni, royal crown of the jinn, if I tell you the story of my connection with this gazelle, will you grant me a 3rd share in this merchant's blood? The efrit agreed to do this if he found the story marvelous, and so the old man began his tale. Know, efrit, that this gazelle is my cousin, my own flesh and blood. I married her when she was still young and stayed with her for 30 years without her bearing me a child. So I took a concubine and she bore me a son, the perfection of whose eyes and eyebrows made him look like the full moon when it appears. He grew up and when he was 15 I had occasion to travel to a certain city, taking with me a great quantity of trade goods. My wife, now this gazelle, had studied sorcery since her youth and she turned the boy into a calf and his mother into a cow, handing them over to the herdsman. When, after a long absence, I got back from my journey, I asked about the 2 of them and my wife told me that the woman had died and that the boy had run away, where she did not know. For a year I remained sad at heart and tearful until Idi Al-Ada came round and I sent to tell the herdsman to bring me a fat cow. What he brought me was my slave girl whom my wife had enchanted. I tucked up my clothes, took the knife in my hand and was about to slaughter her, when she gave a cry, howled and shed tears. This astonished me and, feeling pity for her, I left her and told the herdsman to fetch me another. At that my wife called out, "Kill this one, as I have no finer or fatter cow." I went up again to do the killing and again the cow gave a cry, at which I told the herdsman to slaughter her and then skin her. He did this, only to discover that there was neither flesh nor fat in the carcass, but only skin and bone. I was sorry for what I had done at a time when regret was of no use, and I gave the cow to the herdsman, telling him to bring me a fat calf. He brought me my son, and when this calf caught sight of me, he broke his tether and rolled in the dust in front of me, howling and shedding tears. Again I felt pity and told the herdsman to leave the calf and fetch me a cow, and again my wife, now this gazelle, called to me, insisting that I must slaughter the calf that day. "This is a noble and a blessed day," she pointed out. "The sacrifice must be a good one, and we have nothing fatter or finer than this calf. Look at what happened with the cow that you told me to kill." This led to a disappointment, and we got no good from it at all, leaving me full of regret at having slaughtered it. "This time I am not going to do what you say or kill this calf. By God the Omnipotent, the Compassionate, the Merciful, you must do this on this noble day, and if you don't, then you are not my husband and I am not your wife." On hearing these harsh words, but not realizing what she intended to do, I went up to the calf with the knife in my hand. Morning now dawned and Shahrazad broke off from what she had been allowed to say. "What a good, pleasant, delightful and sweet story this is," exclaimed Dunyazad, at which Shahrazad told her, "How can this compare with what I shall tell you this coming night, if I am still alive and the king spares me?" "By God," the king said to himself, "I am not going to kill her until I hear the rest of the story," and so they spent the rest of the time embracing one another until the sun had fully risen. The king then went to his court as the vizier came with the shroud under his arm, and he gave his judgments, appointing some officials and dismissing others, until evening, but to the vizier's great surprise he gave no instructions about his daughter. The court was then dismissed and King Shahryar returned to his palace. When it was the second night, Dunyazad said to Shahrazad, "Sister, finish your story of the merchant and the efrit for us." "With pleasure," replied Shahrazad, "if the king gives me permission," and when the king gave it, she went on, "I have heard, O fortunate king and rightly guided ruler, that when the merchant was about to cut the throat of the calf, he was moved by pity and told the herdsman to keep the calf among the other beasts." The efrit was listening with astonishment to what the old man with the gazelle was saying, and the man went on. "Lord of the kings of the jinn, while all this was going on, my wife, now this gazelle, was looking on and telling me to kill the calf, because it was fat. But I could not bring myself to do this, and so I told the herdsman to take it away, which he did. The next day, as I was sitting there, he came back to me and said, 'I have something to tell you that will please you, and you owe me a reward for my good news.' I agreed to this and he went on, 'Master, I have a daughter who, as a young girl, was taught magic by an old woman we had staying with us. Yesterday when you gave me the calf, I went to the girl and, when she saw it, she covered her face, shed tears but then burst into laughter. Then she said, 'Father, do you hold me so cheap that you bring strange men in to me?' 'Where are these strange men?' I asked. 'And why are you laughing and crying?' She said, 'This calf you have with you is our master's son, who is under a spell laid upon him and his mother by his father's wife.' This is why I was laughing. But the reason why I wept was that his father killed his mother. I was astonished by this, and as soon as I found that it was morning, I came to tell you." When I heard what the man had to say, I went out with him, drunk, although not on wine, with the joy and delight that I was feeling. When I got to his house, his daughter welcomed me, kissing my hands, while the calf came and rolled on the ground in front of me. I asked her, "Is what you say about this calf true?" "Yes, master," she assured me. "This is your darling son." "Girl," I told her, "if you free him, you can have all the beasts and everything else that your father looks after." She smiled and said, "Master, I only want this on 2 conditions, the first being that you marry me to him, and the second that I be allowed to put a spell on the one who enchanted him and keep her confined, for otherwise I shall not be safe from her scheming." When I heard what she had to say, I promised to give her what she wanted as well as everything that was in her father's charge, adding that I would even give her permission to kill my wife. At that, she took a bowl, filled it with water and recited a spell over it, after which she sprinkled the water over the calf, saying, "If you are a calf and this is how Almighty God created you, stay in this shape and don't change, but if you are under a spell, then return to your original shape with the permission of Almighty God." The calf shuddered and became a man, at which I fell on him and said, "For God's sake, tell me what my wife did to you and your mother." He told me what had happened, and I said, "My son, God has sent you a rescuer to restore your rights." I then married the herdsman's daughter to him, and she transformed my wife into this gazelle, saying, "This is a beautiful shape and not a brutish one, repellent to the sight." The girl stayed with us for some time until God chose to take her to himself, and my son went off to India, the country of the man with whom you have had this experience. I myself took my wife, this gazelle, and have traveled from place to place looking for news of him until fate brought me here and I saw this merchant sitting weeping. This is my story. It is indeed a marvelous tale, the efrit agreed, and I grant you a 3rd share in his blood. At this point, the old man with the 2 Seleucus came up and asked the efrit, "If I tell you what happened to me and my brothers, these 2 dogs, and you find it the most amazing and astonishing of stories, will you transfer to me a 3rd of this man's offense?" The efrit agreed, and the man began. "Lord of the kings of the Jinn, these 2 dogs are my brothers, I being the 3rd. On his death my father left us 3,000 dinars and each one of us opened a shop for trade. I had not been there for long before my eldest brother, now one of these dogs, sold the contents of his shop for 1,000 dinars, bought trade goods and set off on his travels. He had been away for a whole year when one day as I was in my shop a beggar came up to me and stopped. I wished him well, but he said, in tears, 'Don't you know me any more?' When I looked at him closely, I saw that this was my brother, and so I got up to welcome him and brought him into the shop. I asked him how he was and he said, 'Don't ask. My wealth has gone and my circumstances have changed.' I took him to the baths, gave him some of my own clothes and then brought him back home. Then I checked my accounts and the sales figures of my shop and I found that I had made a profit of 1,000 dinars on a capital of 2,000. I divided this with my brother, telling him to forget that he had ever traveled abroad. He took the money gladly and opened another shop. Some time later, my second brother, now this other dog, sold everything he had, with the intention of traveling. We tried unsuccessfully to stop him, but he bought trade goods and set out with some others. He too spent a whole year away before coming back to me in the same state as his brother. 'Brother,' I told him, 'didn't I tell you not to go?' But he replied, 'This was something decreed by fate, and here am I, a poor man, penniless and without even a shirt.' I took him to the baths and gave him a new suit of my own clothes to put on, before bringing him to my shop, where we then ate and drank. I told him, 'Brother, I check the accounts of my shop once every new year and any surplus I find I shall share with you.' When I did my audit, I found that I had 2,000 dinars, and after praising the exalted Creator, I gave him 1,000 and kept the other 1,000 myself. My brother opened another shop, but after a time he and my other brother proposed that I should go off with them on a voyage. I refused, asking, 'What did you get from your travels to make me imagine that I could make a profit?' I refused to listen to them, and we stayed there trading in our shops. Every year they would make the same proposal to me and I would not agree, until after 6 years I finally accepted and told them I would go with them. I asked them to show me what money they had, only to find that they had nothing at all, having squandered everything on food, drink and entertainment. I didn't say a word to them but checked the accounts of my shop and sold what I owned together with all my shop goods, leaving me, to my delight, with a total of 6,000 dinars. I divided this in half, telling my brothers that they and I could have 3,000 dinars with which to trade, while I would bury the remaining 3,000 in case the same thing happened to me as had happened to them. In that case I would have money left over to allow us to reopen our shops. They agreed to this, and I handed each of them 1,000 dinars, keeping 1,000 for myself. We provided ourselves with what we had to have in the way of trade goods and made our preparations for travel, hiring a ship and loading our goods on board. After a whole month's journey we brought them to a city, where they fetched us a tenfold profit. We were about to sail off again when on the shore we came across a girl dressed in rags and tatters. She kissed my hand and asked if I was a charitable man, in which case she would reward me. I love charity and good deeds, I told her, even if you give me no reward. Marry me, master, she said, and take me to your country. I have given myself to you, treat me kindly, for I am someone who deserves kindness and generosity. I shall pay you back for this, and don't be misled by the state I am in now. When I heard this, I felt a yearning for her, as God, the great and glorious, had decreed, and so I took her, gave her clothes and provided her with elegantly furnished accommodation on the ship. I treated her with respect, and as our journey went on I fell so deeply in love with her that I could not bear to leave her by night or by day. In my concern for her I neglected my brothers, who grew jealous of me, envying my wealth and the quantity of my goods. They spent their time eyeing all this, and they discussed killing me and taking what I had, saying, "Let us kill our brother, and then all this will be ours." Satan made this seem good to them, and so, finding me alone and asleep by the side of my wife, they picked us both up and threw us overboard. My wife woke, a shudder ran through her, and she became an efrit. She then carried me to an island where she left me for a time before coming back at dawn and saying, "I am your servant, and it was I who saved your life by carrying you off, with the permission of Almighty God. You must know that I am one of the jinn, and when I saw you I fell in love with you, as God had decreed. For I believe in him and in his apostle, may God bless him and give him peace. I came to you wearing rags, as you saw, but you married me, and now I have saved you from drowning. I am angry with your brothers and will have to kill them." I was astonished to hear this, and I thanked her for what she had done but forbade her to kill my brothers. I then told her the whole story of my dealings with them, and this prompted her to say, "Tonight I shall fly off to them, sink their ship and destroy them." I implored her in God's name not to do that, reminding her of the proverb that tells those who do good to those who wrong them, the evildoer's own deeds are punishment enough for him, and pointing out that, at all events, they were my brothers. She continued to insist, despite my pleading with her, and she then flew off with me and put me down on the roof of my own house. I opened the doors, brought out the money that I had buried, and opened up my shop, after greeting the people there and buying goods for trade. When I went home that evening, I found these 2 dogs tied up, and when they caught sight of me they came up with tears in their eyes and attached themselves to me. Before I realized what was happening, my wife told me, "These are your brothers." "Who did this to them?" I asked, and she said, "I sent a message to my sister. It was she who transformed them, and they will not be freed from the spell for 10 years. My brothers have now been like this for 10 years, and I was on my way to get them released when I came across this man. He told me his story, and I decided not to leave him until I saw what was going to happen between you and him. This is my tale." "It is a marvelous one," agreed the efrit, adding, "I grant you a 3rd share in the blood he owes for his crime." The 3rd old man, with the mule, now said, "If I tell you a more amazing story than these 2, will you grant me the remaining share?" The efrit agreed, and the man went on. "Sultan and leader of the jinn, this mule was my wife. I had been away for a year on my travels, and when I had finished I came back to her. This was at night, and I saw a black slave lying in bed with her. The 2 of them talked, flirted, laughed, kissed and played with each other. My wife caught sight of me and came to me with a jug of water over which she uttered a spell. She sprinkled the water over me and said, 'Leave this shape of yours and take the form of a dog.' Immediately I became a dog and she drove me out through the door of the house. I went on until I came to a butcher's shop, where I started gnawing bones. The butcher saw me and took me into his house, where his daughter covered her face from me and said, "Are you bringing a man into me?" "Where is there a man?" asked her father, and she said, "This dog is a man over whom his wife has cast a spell, but I can free him from it." "Do that, for God's sake," said her father, and she took a jug of water, spoke some words over it, and sprinkled some of it on me. "Go back to your original shape," she said, and that is what I did. I kissed the girl's hand and said, "I would like you to use your magic to do to my wife what she did to me." She gave me some water and told me, "When you find her asleep, sprinkle this water over her, and say what you like, for she will become whatever you want." I took the water and went to my wife, whom I found sleeping. I sprinkled her with the water and said, "Leave this shape and become a mule," which she did there and then, and it is she whom you can see, Sultan and Chief of the Kings of the Jinn. "Is that true?" the man asked the mule, at which it nodded its head, conveying by gesture the message, "That is my story and that is what happened to me." When the old man had finished his tale, the efrit, trembling with delight, granted him a third of the merchant's blood. Morning now dawned and Shahrazad broke off from what she had been allowed to say. "What a good, pleasant, delightful and sweet story this is," exclaimed Dunyazad, at which Shahrazad told her, "How can this compare with what I shall tell you this coming night, if I am still alive and the king spares me?" "By God," the king said to himself, "I am not going to kill her until I hear the rest of this remarkable story," and so they spent the rest of the time embracing one another until the sun had fully risen. The king then went to his court. The troops arrived together with the vizier, and when everyone was there, he gave his judgments, appointing some officials, dismissing others, and issuing orders and prohibitions until evening. The court was then dismissed and the king returned to his palace, where, when night came, he lay again with Shahrazad. When it was the third night, Dunyazad asked her sister to finish the story. "With pleasure," said Shahrazad and went on, "I have heard, O fortunate king, that the third old man told the efrit a more remarkable story than the other two, and that in his astonishment and delight the efrit granted him the remaining share of the blood debt, and allowed the merchant to go free. For his part, the merchant went and thanked the old men, who congratulated him on his safety, after which each of them went home. This, however, is not more surprising than the tale of the fisherman. When the king asked what that was, she went on. "I have heard, O fortunate king, that there once was a poor, elderly fisherman with a wife and 3 children, who was in the habit of casting his net exactly 4 times each day. He went out to the shore at noon one day, put down his basket, tucked up his shirt, waded into the sea and cast his net. He waited until it had sunk down before pulling its cords together and then, finding it heavy, he tried unsuccessfully to drag it in. He took one end of it to the shore and fixed it to a peg that he drove in there, after which he stripped and dived into the sea beside it, where he continued tugging until he managed to get it up. He climbed out delightedly, put his clothes back on and went up to the net, only to find that what was in it was a dead donkey, and that the donkey had made a hole in the net. The fisherman was saddened by this and recited the formula, "There is no might and no power except with God, the exalted, the omnipotent," before saying, "This is the strange thing that God has given me by way of food," and then reciting, "You who court danger, diving in the dark of night, give up, your efforts do not win your daily bread from God. The fisherman rises to earn his keep, there is the sea, with stars woven in the sky. He plunges in, buffeted by waves, his eyes fixed on his billowing net. Happy with his night's work, he takes back home a fish, its jaw caught up on his pronged hook. This fish is bought from him by one who spent his night out of the cold, enjoying his comforts. Praise be to God, who gives and who deprives, for one man eats the fish, another catches it." He encouraged himself, saying that Almighty God would show favor and reciting, "When you are faced with hardship, clothe yourself in noble patience, that is more resolute. Do not complain then to God's servants, you complain to those who have no mercy of the merciful. He freed the donkey from the net, which he then wrung out before spreading it out again and going back into the sea. Invoking the name of God, he made another cast, waited until the net had settled, and found it heavier and more difficult to move than before. Thinking that it must be full of fish, he fastened it to his peg, stripped off his clothes and dived in to free it. After tugging at it, he got it up on shore, only to discover that what was in it was a large jar full of sand and mud. Saddened by this sight, he recited, "Troubles of time, give up. Stop, even if you have not had enough. I came out looking for my daily bread, but I have found there is no more of this. How many a fool reaches the Pleiades? How many wise men lie hidden in the earth?" The fisherman threw away the jar, wrung out his net, cleaned it, and went back a third time to the sea, asking God to forgive him. He made his cast and waited for the net to settle before drawing it in, and this time what he found in it were bits of pots, bottles, and bones. He was furious, and shedding bitter tears, he recited, "You have no power at all over your daily bread, either learning nor letters will fetch it for you. Fortune and sustenance are divided up, one land is fertile while another suffers drought. Time's changes bring down cultured men, while fortune lifts the undeserving up. Come, death, and visit me, for life is vile, falcons are brought down low while ducks are raised on high. Feel no surprise if you should see a man of excellence in poverty, while an inferior holds sway. One bird circles the earth from east to west, another gets its food but does not have to move." He then looked up to heaven and said, "O my God, you know that I only cast my net 4 times a day. I have done this thrice and got nothing, so this time grant me something on which to live." He pronounced the name of God and cast his net into the sea. He waited until it had settled and then he tried to pull it in, but found that it had snagged on the bottom. He recited the formula, "There is no power and no might except with God," and went on. How wretched is this kind of world that leaves us in such trouble and distress. In the morning it may be that things go well, but I must drink destruction's cup when evening comes. Yet when it is asked who leads the easiest life, men would reply that this was I. The fisherman stripped off his clothes and, after diving in, he worked his hardest to drag the net to shore. Then, when he opened it up, he found in it a brass bottle with a lead seal, imprinted with the inscription of our master Solomon, the son of David, on both of whom be peace. The fisherman was delighted to see this, telling himself that it would fetch 10 gold dinars if he sold it in the brass market. He shook it, and discovering that it was heavy as well as sealed, he said to himself, "I wonder what is in it. I'll open it up and have a look before selling it." He took out a knife and worked on the lead until he had removed it from the bottle, which he then put down on the ground, shaking it in order to pour out its contents. To his astonishment, at first nothing came out, but then there emerged smoke which towered up into the sky and spread over the surface of the ground. When it had all come out, it collected and solidified, a tremor ran through it, and it became an efrit with his head in the clouds and his feet on the earth. His head was like a dome, his hands were like winnowing forks, and his feet like ships' masts. He had a mouth like a cave with teeth like rocks, while his nostrils were like jugs and his eyes like lamps. He was dark and scowling. When he saw this efrit, the fisherman shuddered, his teeth chattered, his mouth dried up, and he could not see where he was going. At the sight of him the efrit exclaimed, "There is no God but the God of Solomon, his prophet. Prophet of God, do not kill me, for I shall never disobey you again in word or in deed." "Efrit," the fisherman said, "you talk of Solomon, the prophet of God, but Solomon died 1800 years ago, and we are living in the last age of the world. What is your story, and how did you come to be in this bottle?" To which the efrit replied, "There is no God but God." "I have good news for you, fisherman." "What is that?" the fisherman asked, and the efrit said, "I am now going to put you to the worst of deaths." "For this good news, leader of the efrits," exclaimed the fisherman, You deserve that God's protection be removed from you, you damned creature. Why should you kill me, and what have I done to deserve this? It was I who saved you from the bottom of the sea and brought you ashore. But the Ifrit said, Choose what death you want and how you want me to kill you. What have I done wrong? Asked the fisherman, and why are you punishing me? The Ifrit replied, Listen to my story, and the fisherman said, Tell it, but keep it short as I am at my last gasp. No, fisherman, the Ifrit told him, that I was one of the apostate jinn, and that together with Sakr, the Jinni, I rebelled against Solomon, the son of David, on both of whom be peace. Solomon sent his vizier, Asaph, to fetch me to him under duress, and I was forced to go with him in a state of humiliation to stand before Solomon. I take refuge with God, exclaimed Solomon when he saw me, and he then offered me conversion to the faith, and proposed that I enter his service. When I refused, he called for this bottle, in which he imprisoned me, sealing it with lead and imprinting on it the greatest name of God. Then, at his command, the jinn carried me off and threw me into the middle of the sea. For 100 years I stayed there, promising myself that I would give whoever freed me enough wealth to last him forever, but the years passed, and no one rescued me. For the next 100 years I told myself that I would open up all the treasures of the earth for my rescuer, but still no one rescued me. 400 years later, I promised that I would grant 3 wishes, but when I still remained imprisoned, I became furiously angry and said to myself that I would kill whoever saved me, giving him a choice of how he wanted to die. It is you who are my rescuer, and so I allow you this choice. When the fisherman heard this, he exclaimed in wonder at his bad luck in freeing the Ifrit now, and he went on, Spare me, may God spare you, and do not kill me lest God place you in the power of one who will kill you. I must kill you, insisted the Ifrit, and so choose how you want to die. Ignoring this, the fisherman made another appeal, calling on the Ifrit to show gratitude for his release. It is only because you freed me that I am going to kill you, repeated the Ifrit, at which the fisherman said, Lord of the Ifrits, I have done you good, and you are repaying me with evil. The proverbial lines are right where they say, We did them good, they did its opposite, and this, by God, is how the shameless act. Whoever helps those who deserve no help, will be like one who rescues a hyena. Don't go on so long, said the Ifrit when he heard this, for death is coming to you. The fisherman said to himself, This is a Jinni and I am a human. God has given me sound intelligence which I can use to find a way of destroying him, whereas he can only use vicious cunning. So he asked, Are you definitely going to kill me? And when the Ifrit confirmed this, he said, I conjure you by the greatest name inscribed on the seal of Solomon, and ask you to give me a truthful answer to a question that I have. I shall, replied the Ifrit, who had been shaken and disturbed by the mention of the greatest name, and he went on, Ask your question but be brief. The fisherman went on, You say you were in this bottle, but there is not room in it for your hand or your foot, much less all the rest of you. You don't believe that I was in it? Asked the Ifrit, to which the fisherman replied, I shall never believe it until I see it with my own eyes. Morning now dawned and Shahrazad broke off from what she had been allowed to say.